Hello everyone, I'm Justin, and this is a full timeline recap of the DC Extended Universe, released from 2013 to 2023. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. 10 years removed from the debut of the DC Extended Universe with 2013's Man of Steel, the franchise came to its official end with the release of Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom in December of 2023. So, having had some time to take in the universe's final act, we're now ready to take a look back at the universe's entire timeline and run down everything that took place in chronological order, or at least as closely to it as we can, since there are a few inconsistencies and differing views from the studio, the writers, and directors on when certain things took place. But we're just going to try our best to place things based on when they're hinted or stated to have happened in the films themselves. The timeline we'll be focusing on today, though, is just that of the DCEU canon, so we'll not be going over the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League that released in 2021. But if you'd like for us to one day go over the Snyderverse in a future video, then be sure to let us know in the comments below, and it would also help if you'd leave whatever films you consider as part of the Snyderverse down there as well. To begin, we have to jump all the way back almost 300,000 years to when the gods ruled the earth, with Zeus, the king of the old gods, creating mankind in their image. Zeus's son, Ares, though, soon grew envious of man, and so sought to corrupt his father's creation, poisoning men's hearts with jealousy and suspicion and turning them against one another, resulting in war that ravaged the earth, and for Ares to become known as the god of war. In response, the gods then created the Amazons, an all-female race of superhuman warriors, to influence men's hearts with love and restore peace, which they did for a long time, and both races continue to evolve for another couple 100,000 years. Earth isn't the only planet we're introduced to, though, as we also learn the origins of the planet Krypton, a world with a much harsher environment than Earth's, in which orbits a red star known as the Rao, that in comparison to the sun is much dimmer. Over time, as the Kryptonians continue to evolve, so did their technology, enabling them to enter an era of expansion, launching thousands of scout ships through the stars, including to planet Earth, in search of new worlds to settle upon, some of which they'd build outposts on using great machines called world engines to reshape the planet's environment to their needs. And as a result of this expansion, their civilization flourished for the next 100,000 years. On the topic of other worlds, we next learn of two extra-dimensional entities known as the Enchantress and her brother Incubus, both of whom's origins aren't fully known, but we do know that they somehow end up on Earth at some point during the early days of man, who see the two mystical beings as gods and so worship them as such. Their control over Earth and its people, though, eventually comes to an end, after the humans decide to betray their masters and lock them away in their own respective vials for eternity. But it isn't very long before another otherworldly being comes to try and take over, as Earth is one day invaded by Steppenwolf, the End of Worlds, who lives only to conquer and has killed millions, who then rise again as his army of parademons, nightmare creatures that feed on fear. Along with him in his quest to conquer Earth, Steppenwolf brings 3 perpetual energy matrices called Mother Boxes, that, combined, form the Unity, an apocalyptic power that would not only destroy a world, but transform it into the primordial hellscape of Steppenwolf's birth world. But, despite Steppenwolf wielding all this power, Earth's still able to avoid defeat, thanks to the combined powers of the gods, men, and the Amazons, as well as a species of amphibious humanoids known as the Atlanteans, and an ally from another world called the Green Lantern, who was ultimately killed in the battle, and they successfully forced Steppenwolf to retreat for the first time, leaving the Mother Boxes behind in the process, each of which are entrusted with the Amazons, Atlanteans, and man respectively, with the former two sealing them in secure strongholds, while the latter buries it in secret. Not too long after this battle, though, Ares' corruption of humanity becomes evident once again, as man soon betrays and forces the Amazons into enslavement, while also betraying the gods with help from the powerful supernatural titan, Atlas, who'd crafted a quarterstaff from the Tree of Life that enables him to take some of the gods' powers. He's eventually stopped, though, by a human council of wizards, who manage to steal the staff and take the powers for themselves, which includes the wisdom of Solomon, strength of Hercules, stamina of Atlas, power of Zeus, courage of Achilles, and speed of Mercury. Meanwhile, the Amazons, led by their queen Hippolyta, also managed to free themselves from slavery. Although, in order to do this, one of them had to stay behind and hold back the tide of men. So the Amazons' greatest warrior, Asteria, suited up in all the armor they had and sacrificed herself so her people could survive. As they escaped, Zeus and the other gods came to their defense, but while doing so, were each suddenly killed by Ares until only Zeus remained. forcing the latter to use the last of his powers to stop his son, striking such a blow that he was forced to retreat. Still, Zeus knew he'd return one day to again try and lead mankind to their own destruction. So he conceived a daughter with Hippolyta that he believed could grow powerful enough to one day defeat Ares. Before then, with his dying breath, Zeus created Themyscira to hide the Amazons from Ares in the outside world. In addition, the Council of Wizards, with the staff containing the powers of the gods, chose to encase the god realm in a magical sphere, sealing it away forever to prevent beings like the Titans from entering the human realm again, and creating a barrier that can only be removed if the staff is broken. A few hundred years later, we're taken elsewhere on Earth and introduced to Kahndaq, home to the planet's first self-governing people, which had thrived for centuries until it was taken over by King Akton, who used the army to seize power and force the Kahndaqi people into slavery. His hunger for power didn't stop there though, as Akton, obsessed with dark magic, next set out to forge the crown of Sabak. That, if infused with the powers of the 6 demons of the ancient world, would make him invincible. But, in order to make the crown, he would need a rare mineral of magic properties found only in Kahndaq called Eternium. So he forced his people to dig, until soon, one of Kahndaq's civilians, a young boy named Harut, grew tired of living under Akton's tyrannical rule, and attempted to lead a revolt against him, which was, unfortunately, snuffed out rather quickly, as Akton prepared for Harut to be publicly executed. But just before he could be killed, he's suddenly transported into a mysterious cave, where he's then surrounded by the Council of Wizards, who, seeking to restore the balance, empower Harut with the gifts of ancient gods using the staff, and choose him as their first champion. Even with his newfound powers though, Akton's still able to gain the upper hand against Harut by targeting the ones he loves most, his mother and his father, with his army killing the former and leaving the latter on the brink of death before he's found by Harut, who, in order to save his father, decides to transfer him his power. But, although this works, it ultimately leaves Harut vulnerable to an arrow through the heart from one of the king's assassins. So, Teth Adam, filled with rage and seeking vengeance, makes his way to Akton's palace and intercepts him just before he can gain possession of the completed Crown of Sabak, before unleashing his power onto him, which, in his anger, grows to uncontrollable levels and not only destroys Akton and his palace, but also half of Kahndaq. In addition, Adam inadvertently unleashes the 7 deadly sins onto the world, resulting in even more death and entire civilizations being erased from existence until the Council of Wizards eventually managed to capture the sins once again. And all this destruction Adam's caused ultimately forces the wizards to deem him unworthy of the gifts he'd been granted and unleash an attack on him, which doesn't go very well for the majority of them, as they're each killed outside of the wizard named Shazam, who ultimately manages to imprison Adam in a tomb, as well as hide the Crown of Sabak so that it would never fall into the hands of man again. Shifting focus back to the briefly mentioned Atlanteans for a moment, as one of the 7 kingdoms of Atlantis, the kingdom of Necrus has found itself at odds with the other 6 kingdoms, particularly due to their exploitation of the highly volatile fuel known as orichalcum, that, although making Necrus a superpower unlike any other, has begun poisoning the land, the sea, and the mind of their ruler, King Kordax, who also happens to be the brother of the king of Atlantis, King Atlan, who tried convincing Kordax to stop his use of orichalcum, but he, resentful of Atlan, refused, and instead resorted to dark magic to create the Black Trident, which he then used to transform his people and himself into monsters in a bid to gain power over his brother and take over Atlantis. Kordax's plan ultimately failed though, as Atlan managed to defeat and imprison him and all of Necrus with a spell cast in his own blood to ensure that Kordax's dark power would never be found, striking Necrus from the chronicles in the process. Sometime following the erasure of Necrus from Atlantis' history, the Atlanteans, unfortunately, also become a bit too power hungry, as their continued advancement technologically eventually leads to them unlocking the secret to unlimited energy, prompting a disastrous experiment headed by Atlan that results in their kingdom being swallowed by the ocean in what became known as the Great Fall. But the very power that collapsed Atlantis actually ends up granting them the ability to breathe underwater, and so they were able to create an entirely new kingdom beneath the surface, with many adapting to their new habitat, while others unfortunately regressed and became known as the Trench. King Atlan wouldn't take part in this new future for Atlantis though, as he instead chose to live out the remainder of his days in self-imposed exile, along with the Trident of Atlan, imbued with the power to command the sea. Back to Themyscira now, as Zeus and Hippolyta's daughter, Diana, has now grown into a young girl with a strong desire to one day become a warrior just like her mother. But Hippolyta refuses to let her take part in training, believing their army is strong enough to protect her, and she also chooses to keep Diana's true origins hidden from her, instead claiming that the God Killer is in the form of a sword. Still, despite her mother urging her not to fight, Diana goes behind her back and trains anyway, under the general of the Amazons, Antiope. Although she is eventually caught by her mother, who is at first frustrated, but, after some convincing from Antiope, allows her training to continue, ordering her sister to train Diana harder than any Amazon before, and so she does, eventually molding Diana into Themyscira's fiercest warrior. As Diana continued her training over in Themyscira, the rest of the world engaged in its first World War. At some point during the war, we learn that the British actually end up finding the previously buried Mother Box, but even after studying it, they're unable to figure out exactly what it is, and so they shelve it for the next 100 years. In the war's fourth year, their fight inadvertently ends up resulting in man's first contact with the Amazons in thousands of years, as suddenly one day, an airplane bursts through the force field surrounding Themyscira and crashes into the sea, which Diana quickly fishes the pilot out of before even more men on boats, who the pilot reveals to be the Germans, enter through their force field as well and aim their guns at the island, forcing the Amazons to open fire with their bows at the ship and resulting in a huge battle with many casualties, including Antiope, who's killed after leaping in front of a bullet aimed at Diana, before the Amazons ultimately kill the remaining German soldiers. An angry and distraught Hippolyta then prepares to kill the pilot as well, but Diana convinces her not to, as he just fought by their side. So they instead use the Lasso of Ostia, also known as the Lasso of Truth, on him to learn the cause of this invasion, and he reveals himself to be Captain Steve Trevor of the American Expeditionary Forces assigned to British intelligence, for whom he works as a spy, posing as one of the German army's pilots to gather intel. For his most recent mission, he was sent flying into the Germans' secret military installation in the Ottoman Empire, where he discovered that the leader of the German army, General Erich Ludendorff, was having Turkish scientist Dr. Isabel Marou, also known as Dr. Poison, build them new, secret weapons that, if completed, would result in the deaths of millions. So, Steve went ahead and stole her research notebook before making an escape with one of their planes, which is what eventually led to him crash landing here. This world war he's revealed is going on convinces Diana that Ares has returned, and so she suggests they leave with Steve, but Hippolyta refuses to send her army to fight their war, believing the world of men does not deserve their help. And she attempts to prevent Diana from doing so as well, which ultimately doesn't work, as Diana instead arms herself with a ceremonial shield, lasso, and armor, as well as the God Killer's sword, and joins Steve in his journey off the island, with plans of killing Ares herself. So the two make their way to London, where they're quickly met and aided by Steve's secretary, Etta Candy, who helps get Diana into some normal clothes on their way to delivering Dr. Marou's notebook to Steve's superiors, in particular Sir Patrick Morgan and Field Marshal Douglas Haig. Despite the book containing evidence that Ludendorff is planning to unleash Dr. Poison's new and exceptionally deadly mustard gas at the front though, Haig refuses to move forward with any sort of mission, as they're currently in the midst of negotiating Germany's surrender, and this decision openly frustrates Diana, who runs Haig down for knowingly sacrificing all those lives. She's soon put in better spirits though, after Steve reveals plans of going on the mission anyway to German-occupied Belgium, where Ludendorff and Dr. Marou were last located, to destroy the gas. But before making the trip, Steve needs to track down some reinforcements, who come in the form of a fellow spy named Samir and an expert marksman named Charlie, both of whom decline his offer at first since he won't be able to pay them. But they soon come around following the arrival of Sir Patrick Morgan, who's come to secretly offer assistance and payment for their mission, which they accept. So Steve, Diana, Charlie, and Samir travel to Belgium the following morning, where they eventually meet with Steve's contact, Chief, a traitor and smuggler, who helps guide the four to the Western Front and into the trenches, the state of which shocks Diana and prompts her, despite Steve warning her not to try and cross no man's land, to rush towards the Germans' trench, managing to deflect every shot they fire in her direction along the way, which in turn gives Steve, their teammates, and the other allied soldiers an opening to rush at the Germans as well, and eventually capture their trench, freeing the townspeople of Veld in the process, who celebrate their newfound freedom and the heroes that saved them. Steve and Diana also soon join in on the celebration, with the two sharing a slow dance as the snow falls and making their affection for one another very clear, before deciding to later head inside into the bedroom alone. The day following this victory, the two, Charlie, Samir, and Chief, next make their way to Ludendorff and Dr. Marou's exact location in German High Command, where their intel reports Ludendorff is hosting a gala. So Steve sneaks his way in, disguised as one of the Germans, while Diana also sneaks inside, even though Steve had told her not to, hoping to gain the opportunity to kill Ares, who she believes is Ludendorff. And she nearly succeeds in her mission, but is ultimately stopped by Steve, believing there's no way she'd make it out alive after killing someone in German high command. Although this decision to stop her may have been the wrong one, as shortly after Ludendorff exits the party, he and Dr. Poison finally unleash her completed gas on the front, killing thousands of troops on both sides, as well as the village's civilians, and prompting a distraught Diana to immediately follow after Ludendorff on horseback, eventually tracking him down inside a communications tower within a complex behind the castle, where they're preparing a larger supply of the gas to be dropped on London. Once in the tower, she unleashes an attack on the general, although the brawl isn't as one-sided as she would have hoped, thanks to Ludendorff having inhaled a gas Maru had made specifically for him that enhances his strength and endurance. But ultimately, she's able to gain full control and kill him with the Godkiller's sword. His death doesn't have the effect she had expected though, as the war continues on, proving to her that men are the actual true cause behind all of this destruction. And so, when Steve comes to her begging to help stop the gas from being unleashed on London, she refuses, reiterating her mother's claim that mankind does not deserve her help. So, Steve heads off with Charlie Samir in chief to rid of the bombs, while Diana's suddenly met in the tower by Sir Patrick Morgan, who reveals himself to be Ares, and explains that, although he's whispered ideas, formulas, and weapons into the ears of men over the years, he's never actually made them use them, and it really is mankind who've chosen to destroy the world and themselves. So, he now hopes that Diana will join him in ridding of them once and for all, to bring the world back to the paradise it was before. But she refuses, and instead attempts to kill him with the Godkiller. However, that doesn't work, as he easily destroys the weapon before revealing that she is the true Godkiller left behind by Zeus. So the two engage in a huge battle that Ares maintains control over the majority of, at one point sending Diana flying back into Steve, who'd been making his way towards the airborne bomber, since he, seeing no other way to take down the aircraft without releasing the gas onto thousands, plans to board it and destroy them himself. So, he says a farewell to Diana, telling her he wishes they had more time and that he loves her, before hopping on the plane, taking out the pilot, flying it up to near maximum altitude, and shooting the gas bombs with his pistol, resulting in a huge explosion that takes his life. A heartbroken Diana witnesses this from below, and is pushed to fight even harder by his sacrifice, enabling her to ultimately get the better of Ares, whose powers she's able to absorb with her bracelets and unleash back onto him to kill him. Shortly following the death of Ares, the war ends as well, which Diana, along with Etta, Samir, Charlie, and Chief, joins the world in celebrating, while also mourning the loss of the man she loved. Moving ahead for a moment now into 1974, upstate New York, as a young boy named Thaddeus Savannah travels to his grandfather's house in a car with his older brother Sid and their father while playing with a magic 8-ball, which his family continuously teases him about, before he then finds himself alone in the vehicle and ending up inside a mysterious cave called the Rock of Eternity, where he's met by Shazam. Shazam explains that, as the years have passed, he's grown weak, so he now seeks a champion to inherit his magic. But in order for him to choose Thaddeus as his champion, he first must demonstrate that he's pure of heart and strong in spirit. So the 7 deadly sins begin to tempt him, claiming they can give him even greater power if he takes the Eye of Sin, and so he begins reaching out towards it, forcing Shazam to zap him with his staff and deem him unworthy, before transporting him back to the car with his family, which prompts Thaddeus to whine and complain, and the commotion ultimately causes their father to crash and fly out the windshield, being severely injured in the process, and Sid shouts at and blames Thad for this, while Thad sees a message on his 8-ball that reads, "Find us." Meanwhile, back in the Rock of Eternity, the 7 deadly sins acknowledge Shazam's growing weakness, and that soon he won't be able to contain them. So Shazam uses a seeking spell to find a soul that's worthy. It takes quite some time for Shazam to actually find a worthy soul though, so we'll instead shift our focus back to the planet Krypton, which by 1980 has actually found itself on the brink of an implosion as a result of its inhabitants carelessly mining from the planet's core, making it unstable. And this exhaustion of their own natural resources had also put an end to their space exploration, leaving their outposts abandoned. A big reason for this collapse of Krypton's civilization could be attributed to the establishment of artificial population control, which saw the end of birthing children naturally, as they opted to instead genetically manipulate and create infants within the planet's Genesis chamber using Krypton's growth codex. an ancient Kryptonian artifact that serves as a database for their genetic history, so that each Kryptonian would be bred with a specific purpose from birth. So now, with the planet's destruction imminent, Krypton's foremost scientist, Jor-El, and his wife, Lara Lorvan, decide to birth Krypton's first natural-born child in centuries, their son Kal-El, and combine his DNA with the growth codex as they plan on sending him to a new, inhabitable planet in hopes that one day he'd be able to access the information and revive their species, although not through genetic manipulation, as the two believe Kryptonians deserve the opportunity to become something other than what society had intended for them. Their plan to send their son away is nearly interrupted, though, by Krypton's military leader and a former friend of Jor-El, General Drew Zod, who's in the midst of overthrowing Krypton's Law Council and taking charge himself so that he can then start anew, seeking to sever the bloodlines that led them to this state before locating a new home to birth a new generation of Kryptonians with the use of the Codex. Jor-El, though, believing the decision of whether these bloodlines deserve to live or die isn't one for Zod to make, refuses to give up the Codex, prompting a brawl between the two as Kal-El's aircraft is launched into space that ends with Zod stabbing and killing Jor-El, before then being surrounded alongside his subcommander, Farah Ul, and his followers, the Sword of Rao, by forces loyal to the Council, who, for their crimes of murder and high treason, sentenced Zod and his followers to the Phantom Zone, to which they're transported in the Black Zero starship after their bodies are encased in a preservative gel just moments prior to Krypton's ultimate destruction. Kal-El's starship, meanwhile, completes its journey to Earth, crash landing in Smallville, Texas, where it's discovered by two local farmers, Jonathan and Martha Kent, who decide to raise the baby as their own and name him Clark Kent. Back in the Black Zero starship, though, Zod and his followers find themselves suddenly freed from their preserved states as a result of their home planet's destruction, and appear destined to float amongst the ruins of it for the remainder of their days, until they manage to avoid this grim fate by retrofitting the Phantom projector that was used to transport them to the Phantom Zone into a Phantom Drive, enabling them to transport the ship across space into Krypton's old colonial outposts, which had, unfortunately, withered and died long ago after being cut off from Krypton. But he and his army do still manage to salvage armor, weapons, and even a world engine throughout their journey, although they don't yet find a planet to use it on. Heading back to Earth now about a year later, as we're introduced to the Wayne family, one of the most powerful and influential families in Gotham City, made up of Thomas Wayne, the CEO of prominent conglomerate company Wayne Enterprises, his wife Martha, and their son Bruce, as they're heading home from the Aragon Theater after seeing The Mark of Zorro. Tragedy quickly strikes the family, though, when they're confronted and held at gunpoint by a mugger named Joe Chill, who, after Thomas attempts to strike and disarm the criminal, shoots and kills both him and Martha, while sparing the life of a horrified and traumatized Bruce, who, following their deaths, is left to be raised by the family butler and bodyguard, Alfred Pennyworth. A short while later, during his parents' funeral, Bruce, overcome with grief, breaks away from the service and eventually, inadvertently runs and falls into a cavern beneath the estate filled with bats, one of his greatest fears. Just about a decade before we can see the lasting effects of Bruce's traumatizing childhood, though, we first need to meet back up with Princess Diana, who, by 1984, has begun going by the name Diana Prince and become a senior anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. But her attempt at living a normal life hasn't stopped her from using her incredible abilities to help out when she can, as we see when she apprehends 4 men attempting to run off with stolen antiques, which had been being sold through a black market operation within the mall. With this operation being shut down as a result of Diana's interference, the FBI sends the stolen antiques over to the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, where Diana, along with the socially awkward Dr. Barbara Ann Minerva, helps to identify them. The most notable of these antiques we see is called the Dreamstone, with a Latin inscription that reads, "Place upon the object held but one great wish," which makes Barbara wonder what she'd wish for if the stone could actually grant one, while Diana appears to have already decided on hers. Barbara does eventually also decide on a wish of her own, though, stemming from her desire to be perceived by the world the same way Diana is. And so, that night, she returns to the museum and grabs the Dreamstone in hopes that it would grant her wish of being just like her, which it appears it possibly has, as the following morning, she receives a noticeably increased amount of attention from her coworkers, as well as catches the attention of Max Lord, founder of the Black Gold Oil Cooperative, who's come to receive a tour of their facility, with him specifically asking that Barbara be the one to show him around. and by the end of it, he decides to give his entire donation to her department, which he plans to announce at the members gala that night. But although giving off the appearance of an incredibly successful businessman, we soon learn that Max isn't really as well off as he makes it seem, as his company is actually on the brink of going under due to him only owning potentially oil-rich land and no oil itself. Max, primarily hoping to turn things around so he can make his son proud, has put together a plan to fix things involving the Dreamstone, hence why he's shifted his attention to the Smithsonian and attends their gala that night, where he again meets up with Barbara, who he quickly seduces before the two then head up to her office where she left the stone to hook up, giving Max the perfect opportunity to gain possession of it, before then taking it back with him to his company's facility to make his one great wish of becoming the Dreamstone itself. It's revealed later that the Dreamstone was originally created by the Duke of Deception and God of Lies, Deca Lafreya Arrow, also known as Dolos, who empowered it with the ability to grant any one wish per person that comes in contact with it, although that wish would come at the cost of their most valued possession. And so Max, now that he wields the Dreamstone's power, begins granting the wishes of others so that he can then take whatever he needs from them in return. And this plan works in turning black gold into an actual success. Diana had also become aware of the Dreamstone's power while at the gala, where she was approached by a seemingly random man who she'd initially brushed off, until it was revealed that her wish from earlier had been granted, and that the man's body had somehow been taken over by Steve Trevor's soul, who she then returned home and spent the night with, until eventually deciding they should try and figure out how any of this is even possible. So they head back to the Smithsonian, where they meet up with Barbara and are told of how she'd given up the stone to Max, infuriating Diana, who next sneaks into Max's facility in search of him or the stone, none of which are there to be found, as all they end up finding is the evidence left behind from his transformation into it. So Diana calls up and asks Barbara to look into the stone's history, and she reveals that it had popped up in various places over the years, particularly in civilizations that later collapsed catastrophically, with no trace as to why, including the Mayan civilization. So the three seek out a Mayan shaman named Babajid, who claims to also know of the stone, and through him, they learn that the only way to stop the stone from destroying the world as they know it is to either destroy it or have everyone renounce their wish, both of which Barbara refuses to do. And Diana also believes they should look for another way, not wanting to lose Steve again. Things continue to get worse and worse the longer Max has the stone's power though, as each wish he grants continues to devolve their civilization, as well as make Max himself grow sicker and sicker. But none of this stops him, and he instead turns his focus to the President of the United States, who he, as he's done with everyone else, convinces into making a wish, with the President specifically wishing for more nuclear weapons, and in return, Max gains absolute autonomy from the government. Also in the President's office, Max notices a presentation for a top-secret global broadcast satellite program that enables them to override any broadcast system in the world using particle beam technology, which bathes the landscape in a signal of particles. And so Max demands immediate access to the satellite, believing it to be the perfect way of reaching everyone across the world at once. Before he can be escorted out of the White House though, he's intercepted by Diana and Steve, who take down his team of US officials before then being taken down themselves by Barbara, who, along with Diana's charm, has also gained her power, which she now uses against her to ensure her wish doesn't get taken away, and she proves to actually be too powerful for Diana, who in exchange for her wish, has begun losing her powers. Now, with Barbara by Max's side, Steve and Diana are forced to acknowledge the fact that, in order to stop them, Diana must renounce her wish. And so, after the two share I love yous and one final kiss, she does just that, before flying back home to don a brand new suit made from the previously mentioned Amazon warrior Asteria's armor, which Diana had found at some point during her failed search of Asteria herself. And once suited up, she then flies over to the location of Max's broadcast, which has already begun, allowing him and Barbara to grow even more powerful, with Barbara in particular being granted the world's rage and prowess, which results in her losing whatever humanity she had left, and instead adopting a form resembling that of a cheetah, which is how she's found when Diana arrives, who's forced to engage in a brawl with her that she ultimately comes out on top of, before heading inside to stop Max. She struggles to get anywhere near him though, as the tornado-like winds surrounding him send her flying back. So she instead interrupts his broadcast with one of her own, using the lasso of truth, encouraging everyone to renounce their wish and return the world to the way it was, which incredibly actually ends up working. while Max is ultimately convinced to renounce his wish as well, after seeing how the chaos he's created has put his son's life in danger. So, with everyone's wishes renounced, life is able to completely return back to normal, as there are seemingly no lingering consequences resulting from anything that had taken place. While elsewhere on Earth, it's revealed that Diana isn't the only Amazon living among us. As it turns out, Asteria is still alive, and still uses her abilities to help out when she can. In the year following all of this, in 1985 Maine, we're finally able to revisit the Atlanteans, with us specifically being introduced to the current Queen of Atlantis, Queen Atlanna, just moments after she'd fled the kingdom and to the surface to avoid her arranged marriage to King Orvax. She'd been wounded during her journey though, resulting in her passing out the moment she arrives on shore, where she's found and looked after by a lighthouse keeper named Tom Curry, who she quickly ends up falling in love with, and this love the two share also leads just a year later to the birth of their son Arthur Curry, who Atlanna believes could one day be the one to unite their two worlds. Just a few short years after his birth though, the Curry's home is suddenly under attack by Atlantean soldiers, sent by Orvax to retrieve Atlanna. And although she manages to take out this group of soldiers, she believes they'll just continue coming after her. So, in order to keep her family safe, she returns to Atlantis, but assures Tom that she'll return to him one day. Into the early 1990s now, into outer space, as American astronauts near the end of the Cold War shockingly discover a gigantic starfish-like extraterrestrial that they later name Starro. And, seeing the potential in weaponizing the creature, they decide to capture it. The United States refuses to study the beast on their own soil though, and so they instead make a secret deal with the Corto-Maltese government to conduct their illegal experiments in a Nazi-built scientific experimentation facility called Jotunheim, and hire hyper-intelligent metahuman scientist Dr. Gaius Greaves, aka the Thinker, to oversee them. Also in the early 90s, we're introduced to the supervillain leader of a white supremacist organization called the Aryan Empire, the White Dragon Augie Smith, along with his two sons Keith and Christopher Smith, the former of whom Augie openly favors. From birth, both Chris and Keith were trained by their father to become powerful assassins just like him, with Augie even at one point forcing a young Chris to kill a man with a screwdriver, in addition to regularly having his two sons compete in no-holds-barred brawls for him and his pals to bet on. Unfortunately though, one of these brawls would inevitably take a fatal turn, as Keith, after being rocked by a huge strike from his younger brother, ends up having a seizure and shockingly passes away, adding another scarring memory to Chris's childhood and to Augie's resentment of him. Thankfully, we don't meet many parents, if any, that are nearly as bad as Christopher's father, but we do meet some asshole kids, including Clark Kent's middle school bully, Pete Ross. Although his constant bullying of Clark is interrupted one day while on the bus with their classmates after its tires are suddenly blown out, causing the driver to lose control and resulting in the vehicle being driven off the bridge and into the river below. But, fortunately for everyone inside, Clark's able to push the bus back onto land, nearly getting himself and his powers caught in the process. So his father reminds him that he must keep this side of him a secret until the world is ready to accept him for who he is. Clark's still frustrated and confused though, since he's yet to be told why he is this way. And so his father finally tells him the truth, unveiling the Kryptonian starship he'd arrived in, and thus revealing that he'd actually been sent to Earth from another planet. And, although they don't yet understand why, Jonathan expresses belief that Clark will one day uncover that reason for himself. Now finally, around 15 years after the death of his parents, we're able to revisit Bruce Wayne, now in his early 20s, and who, since their murder, has spent years training to reach peak physical condition and become a master martial artist, while also becoming the new CEO of Wayne Enterprises and continuing to grow his family's fortune, which, combined with his skills in combat, he uses to become the masked vigilante known as Batman, an alter ego created out of anger and his desire for vengeance against those within Gotham's criminal underworld. On to 1997 now, as we witness tragedy strike the Kent family, who, while driving on the highway, were forced to abandon their trip and their vehicle as a tornado began sweeping through the area, with Jonathan urging Clark to get his mother to safety while also ushering others out of harm's way. Jonathan ends up trapped though while retrieving the family dog, Hank, so Clark prepares to go help him, but his father signals for him to stay put, believing it still isn't yet time for him to show the world what he really is, and instead, Jonathan's swept away and killed by the storm. In the year following this, we return back to Atlantis, as King Orvax finally discovers that Queen Atlanna had birthed a child on land. And so, despite the two having birthed a child of their own within the past 9 years, named Orm, he has her sacrificed to the trench for her affair, Prior to her sacrifice, though, Atlanta's close friend and the chief counselor to the throne of Atlantis, Noetus Volko, makes her a promise in secret that he'll look after and guide Arthur. A promise he quickly makes good on about a year later as he begins teaching her son about his Atlantean heritage, as well as how to swim, communicate, and fight as they do. For this next section on the timeline, there wasn't quite enough information given for us to exactly pinpoint when the following events took place. So we can only really say that they happened at some point after World War I and before or during 1999. The first of these events is the discovery of an ancient relic of alien origin known as the Scarab, which had laid dormant for thousands of years in Egypt until it was found by renowned oncologist Professor Dan Garrett. And upon him coming in contact with the Scarab, it suddenly activated and fused itself to the professor, enabling him to be transformed into a living weapon. Now one with the Scarab, Garrett learned that it was actually a sentient being named Kaji Da. But, although continuing to study the Scarab further with his former student and close friend Ted Cord, it's not clear whether or not the two managed to uncover exactly where the being came from. They do learn through their studies, though, that Kaji Da's primary function is to keep its host alive for the sake of self-preservation, and that, once you're chosen to be its host, it fuses itself to every cell in your body and connects to your brain, so there's no way to physically remove it other than death. Years following the formation of Dan and Kaji Da's symbiotic bond, Dan eventually meets his end under unspecified circumstances. But we do know that, in his final moments, he decides to pass the Scarab onto Ted, although he's never actually able to become one with the being or harness its incredible power, as only Kaji Da can choose who it'll bond with next. But Ted doesn't allow his inability to connect with the Scarab stop him, as he instead uses his high level of intellect and plethora of resources, thanks to his father, Thomas Cord, being the CEO of multi-billion-dollar multinational defense contractor Cord Industries, along with his research of Kaji Da to develop his own gadgets, equipment, and suits to combat crime in Palmyra City as the Blue Beetle. Ted and Thomas aren't the only Cords we meet, as we're also introduced to Thomas's daughter and Ted's older sister, Victoria, who we learn had actually helped her father start up Cord Industries and transform it into the military powerhouse it is now. Although, in order to make the company such a success, Victoria chose to do some morally corrupt business, such as selling weapons to fund guerrilla forces in Guatemala during the 36-year-long Guatemalan Civil War, some of which we see destroy the home of a young boy named Ignacio Carapax, in addition to taking the life of his mother. We also see that Victoria herself soon finds Ignacio amongst the ruins of his home, and, upon seeing him in this vulnerable state and believing he could be easily manipulated, she orders for him to be sent to a military group and has him molded into a soldier, with Carapax eventually being given the rank of lieutenant. One day though, Carapax accidentally steps out onto a hidden landmine, resulting in severe injuries to one of his arms and one of his legs. And Victoria takes this opportunity to conduct a procedure to replace his limbs with cybernetically enhanced ones. This procedure, as well as the decades of war he'd fought through, weakens Carapax's memory, and so he's since forgotten the role Victoria played in his mother's death, and has now grown a strong loyalty towards her, leading to him becoming her primary bodyguard. Back to Arthur Curry and Noetus Volko though, as Arthur, the older he gets, begins to ask more and more questions about his mother, confused as to why she's never come to see him herself. And so Volko's forced to reveal the truth of what happened to her, leaving Arthur filled with guilt over her death, seeing as he was the main cause. Heading over to Portugal now to meet a young girl named Cleo Caso and her father, the latter of whom's drug abuse has left them stuck living on the streets. But despite their living situation, the two still share a very close and loving bond. Other than their love for one another, they're also able to survive on the streets thanks to a device her father's built that allows him to communicate with and control rats, which he has bring them food and other trinkets, as well as keep them warm at night. And he also begins using his rat communicator to steal other valuables himself, becoming known as the Rat Catcher. Eventually though, her father's drug problems result in his death, and so Cleo's left to fend for herself and continues to survive thanks to the rats. Next, we're introduced to another family, made up of Henry and Nora Allen and their son Barry, moments following Nora's return home from the supermarket, where she'd gone and forgotten to pick up a can of tomatoes. So Nora asks Henry to head back over and pick them up instead, which he does, while Barry heads up to his room to finish his homework. Although he isn't up there for long, as, after hearing a scream from the kitchen, he quickly rushes back downstairs, where he finds his father, who just arrived home, holding a fatally wounded Nora in his arms and screaming for Barry to call 911. Sadly, Nora ultimately passes away, and Henry, with there being no other suspects, is actually convicted for her murder, despite Barry believing he's innocent, with him being given a life sentence at Iron Heights Penitentiary. A year later, we learn of yet another family-related death, this time being the entirety of the Bertinelli crime family, one of the most powerful and richest families in Gotham City, who are all rounded up at their mansion by the Galante crime family and the Black Mask Roman Sionis' criminal organization before being fatally gunned down. Despite ridding of the Bertinellis though, Sionis and the Galantes find themselves unable to take control of the family's fortune, since it was actually encrypted in the Bertinelli diamond, which still remains hidden. So they're left searching for it for the next several years. And in addition to this hiccup, it turns out that the massacre hadn't actually killed every single member of the family, as the head of the family, Franco Bertinelli's daughter, Helena, managed to survive the hit before being discovered alive by one of the mobsters, who, filled with guilt, chooses to sneak her back to his home, where she's raised by him, his father, and his brother, all of whom are assassins. Shifting our attention for a brief moment back to the Cord family once again, as Ted Cord, now the CEO of Cord Industries after the position was left for him, much to his sister's surprise, by their father following his death, and who's also, since the last time we saw him, birthed a daughter named Jenny with his wife, who sadly passed on, just suddenly disappears one day, leaving no sign of where he may have gone. Although, before he does, he manages to hide the scarab somewhere in Antarctica, in hopes that its power wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, like those of Victoria, who, at some point, also became aware of the scarab, and, following Ted's disappearance, assumes his role as CEO of the company and begins a multi-year search for it. On the topic of disappearing family members, in 2008, we're taken to the Philadelphia Winter Carnival as a young boy named Billy Batson loses sight of his single mother, Marilyn, in a crowd of people. And, although comforted by a couple police officers, he never ends up being found by her, and is instead left to be raised by the foster system. Back to Gotham City now, as we're taken for the first time to Arkham Asylum, where we meet one of their psychiatrists, Dr. Harleen Quinzel, assigned to the homicidal crime lord and arch-nemesis of Batman known as the Joker, who Harleen, after several meetings with the Clown Prince of Crime, actually begins to fall for, ultimately resulting in her aiding him in his escape one day in hopes that he would then fall for her. But he, instead, subjects her to shock therapy, making her even crazier than she already was before making his grand exit. Despite him having fractured her mind, Harleen's love for the Joker appears to have grown even stronger, and she continues to pursue him, even at one point chasing him down on a motorcycle, which prompts Joker to then take her to the Ace Chemicals facility in Gotham, where, as the two stand over a vat of chemicals, he has her pledge an oath to live and die for him, before having her engage in her final test, that being to free fall into the vat. Joker didn't actually plan on using this as a test though, and rather as a way to finally get rid of her. But for some reason, his mind is suddenly changed, and he decides to instead jump into the vat along with her to pull her out. And after the two share a kiss, and with Harleen now having completely fallen off the deep end mentally, she and Joker become the king and queen of Gotham City, while she also decides to take on a new persona, becoming known as Harley Quinn. Not too long into their run at the top of Gotham's criminal underworld, the two shift their attention back onto Batman, as well as his sidekick, Robin, an alias taken on by Bruce Wayne's adopted son, Dick Grayson, who, like Bruce, had also witnessed the death of his parents up close. And although we aren't told the exact details of what Joker does to the Boy Wonder, it is confirmed that he ultimately kills Grayson, with Harley Quinn there as an accomplice, before spray painting a message to Batman on his suit. Heading back over to Central City, as Barry Allen, now a freshman at Central City College, has begun studying criminal law in hopes of one day clearing his father's name, and often spends his time conducting research at the Central City Crime Lab. One night though, during a thunderstorm, Barry, while seated in the lab, is suddenly struck by a lightning bolt that enters through the window, and, combined with the various chemicals that spill onto Barry as a result, he's granted the ability to move at superhuman speeds. Speaking of abilities, we once again meet back up with a now adult Clark Kent as he continues his search across the world for the origins of his, which, while working as a busboy at a diner in Canada, he gets slightly closer to uncovering, as he overhears a couple of soldiers discussing a discovery made in the ice on Ellesmere Island. Intrigued by the lead, Clark manages to get a job under a false identity at the Arctic Cargo Helicopter Company, which provides hired air assistance to the base of the investigation, including for the likes of award-winning newspaper reporter for the Daily Planet based in Metropolis, Lois Lane, who's arrived to also look into this strange discovery, currently being kept top secret by the US military. Clark, after helping Lois settle in, heads off alone that night to get a closer look at whatever they found. And it turns out to be the previously mentioned scout ship Krypton had sent to Earth, also known as the Fortress of Solitude, in which he finds a keyhole that shares a similar shape to a device his father Jonathan had found inside the Kryptonian starship he'd arrived in. And so Clark enters the command key into the hole, turning the ship online, as well as a hologram of his biological father, Jor-El's consciousness, who he attempts to approach before being interrupted by the sudden screams of Lois Lane, who'd also came to get a closer look at the ship, but upon entering, was attacked by the ship's security system, which wounds her lower abdomen before Clark shows up and destroys the device. He then uses his heat vision to cauterize her wound, before removing her from and flying the ship over to another remote location in the Arctic, where he's finally able to learn where he came from and why he is the way he is through Jor-El's consciousness, who reveals basically everything we'd covered earlier, on top of a few new revelations, like how this scout ship actually contains its own Genesis chamber, before then revealing the science behind Clark's superpowers, explaining that his cells have drunken in the radiation of the Earth's younger and brighter sun, strengthening his muscles, skin, and senses to a point he hadn't imagined possible. Jor-El also explains why they'd sent Clark to Earth, as he and his mother believed he could embody the best of both their worlds and help guide the people of Earth so they don't make the same mistakes they did, before then presenting Clark with a red and blue suit adorned with the House of El symbol on its chest, representing hope. And Clark, with this new understanding of his power and purpose, dons his new suit and flies off to test the limits of his abilities. Lois Lane, meanwhile, after her encounter with Clark, immediately looks to write a story on what took place, but her boss, Perry White, refuses to print it, since there's no way for her to actually prove anything that happened. So Lois begins a quest to track her rescuer down, meeting with his various employers and locating people from his past like Pete Ross, before ultimately making it to the doorstep of his mother, Martha's home, through whom she's able to get a meeting with Clark himself at his father's grave, where Clark explains his father's desire to keep his abilities hidden from the world until they were ready to know the truth, and how he'd sacrificed himself to protect his secret. And so Lois decides to drop the story, believing it's his to tell. Unfortunately, he doesn't end up remaining hidden for much longer, as that night, television screens and monitors across the world are interrupted by a message from General Drew Zod, who reveals to the people of Earth that an alien has been living among them, and demands that he be turned over within the next 24 hours, threatening that Earth will suffer the consequences if he isn't. And so, Kal-El turns himself over to General Calvin Swanwick and the US military, so that they can then turn him over to Zod. But during the exchange, the Sword of Rao also demands that Lois Lane accompany them, aware of her previous knowledge of Clark's existence, and so she gives herself up as well. Upon boarding the Black Zero, Clark grows significantly weaker due to the ship's Kryptonian atmosphere, allowing them to chain him down as Zod reveals how they'd managed to locate him after all this time, explaining that when Clark activated the ancient scout ship, it had actually sent out a distress beacon, pinpointing its location on Earth, which they now plan on transforming into Krypton's new home using their world engine. Their attempt at removing Clark as a roadblock in their quest is soon thwarted though, thanks to Lois, who, just before entering the Black Zero, Clark had covertly handed his command key over to, that she now enters into a keyhole found within her cell, resulting in the arrival of Jor-El's consciousness, who, while explaining to her how Clark could stop Zod, hacks into the ship's mainframe and modifies its atmospheric composition to human compatibility, which restores Clark's superhuman strength and allows him and Lois to escape back to Earth. Shortly following their return, Clark and Lois once again meet with General Swanwick and explain how together they could defeat Zod, as Jor-El had revealed that if they were able to drop the Phantom Drive from within the starship Clark had arrived in onto the Black Zero, then it, combined with Zod's Phantom Drive, would form a black hole that would suck him and his followers back to the Phantom Zone, and so Swanwick agrees to move ahead with their plan. Zod, though, has already begun unleashing the World Engine, working in tandem with the Black Zero onto Earth, with the World Engine being sent to the southern Indian Ocean, while the Black Zero causes mass panic in Metropolis, prompting the now superpowered Barry Allen to run his way over in an attempt to offer assistance, despite him not yet fully understanding his powers. But unfortunately, he's only capable at the moment of saving one little boy. Clark, meanwhile, has flown over to the Indian Ocean to destroy the World Engine, which, despite some struggle, he successfully manages to do. while back in Metropolis, the US Air Force prepares to drop the Phantom Drive onto the Black Zero, although they're soon interrupted by Zod arriving in the Fortress of Solitude, which he'd managed to take over by overriding Jor-El's command key with one of his own. But before he can unleash an attack on the aircraft, Clark arrives as well and sends him and the scout ship crashing to the ground below, enabling them to then send the two Phantom Drives crashing into one another, which, as expected, creates a black hole that the Black Zero and Zod's entire army are sucked into. The day isn't saved yet though, as an even more powerful Zod, having adapted to Earth's atmosphere, once again appears amid the destruction and attacks Clark, and the two's ensuing battle quickly causes even more destruction to the city, all of which is seen from below by Bruce Wayne, who'd only just arrived via helicopter in a rush to try and aid those stuck inside of Wayne Tower, the headquarters of Wayne Enterprises' financial division. But, similar to Barry earlier, he's unable to offer much help, as the Kryptonians' battle ultimately results in the collapse of his building, and in the end, Bruce is only able to save two people. One being an employee of his he managed to free from beneath the rubble named Wallace Keefe, and a little girl whose mother was taken out along with the building she was trapped inside of. Bruce is then left to watch as Clark and Zod crash land in a train station, where Zod, unable to regain control in their battle, opts to instead present Clark with a choice, refusing to end this war until one of them dies, and so he aims his heat vision at a nearby family trapped in a corner, and forces Clark to choose between committing his first murder in order to save the civilians, or to let them die as to not break his no-kill rule, and Clark reluctantly chooses the former, snapping Zod's neck. In the aftermath of the Black Zero event, most of the world, although still somewhat fearful of such a powerful being walking among them, decides to put their faith in Superman, under the belief that he truly is here to protect them. And Clark, when he's not fighting crime, decides to get a job at the Daily Planet, believing it to be the perfect place for him to keep his ear to the ground and keep his secret identity hidden, as well as spend some extra time with Lois Lane, who he soon begins dating. Shifting focus back to Barry Allen though, who, after failing miserably during the Black Zero event, puts the work in to try and master his new abilities, and also works on a new suit to more comfortably use them, which he dons during one of his earliest excursions as a vigilante to apprehend a notorious thief named Digger Harkness, also known as Captain Boomerang, who, after failing to rob the Central City Diamond Exchange and pin it on his partner, is sent to Belle Reve. In addition to Boomerang, Belle Reve also soon becomes the new home of one Harley Quinn, who, after a night spent at Joker's club, during which he kills a crime boss known as Monster T for commenting on Harley's beauty, joins her lover on a joyride through Gotham City that's soon interrupted by Batman, hoping to finally take the two lovers down. Unfortunately for him though, despite sending the two crashing into the ocean, he only manages to capture Harley, who he then has locked up in the Supermax prison. Just 2 months following this, Batman once again manages to track down and send another criminal to Belle Reve, with him this time apprehending Floyd Lawton, an expert marksman and assassin known as Deadshot, thanks to an anonymous tip that we later learn was sent from a high-ranking US government official and the director of the government organization Argus, Amanda Waller, who'd managed to pinpoint Lawton's location while he was out with his daughter Zoe ahead of Christmas. And so, Batman arrives, and although Deadshot tries to put up a fight against him, he ultimately allows himself to be turned in after seeing the frightened look on his daughter's face. Staying in Gotham, we're next introduced to Gotham City University's star football player, Victor Stone, as his life is suddenly changed in early 2015 during a drive home with his mother Eleanor, as both he and his mother are fatally wounded in a car accident that ultimately takes Eleanor's life. And it likely would have taken Victor's as well if it weren't for his father, Silas, who also happens to be the head scientist at Star Labs, using his scientific expertise combined with an incredibly powerful device found on the shelves of Star Labs that turns out to be the previously buried Mother Box to transform Victor into a cyborg and in turn save his life. Victor, though, views this new version of himself more akin to a monster than a human being, and so refuses to let himself be seen for quite some time, leading most to assume that he died in the crash with his mother anyway. Traveling all the way over to the war-torn Nairobi, Africa now, as we meet back up with the Daily Planet's Lois Lane, who's made the trip along with photographer Jimmy Olsen to interview the African warlord Amajag. Although this interview quickly goes sideways when one of Amajag's security guards, Anatoly Kanayev, discovers a tracker hidden inside of Olsen's camera, blowing Jimmy's cover and forcing him to reveal that he's actually a CIA operative, which Lois had no clue about before Amajag promptly kills him. Lois is then taken into her own cell to be interrogated, but before he can question her about anything, the warlord's interrupted by the sudden sounds of gunfire, which actually turns out to be coming from within his own men, as half of them, led by Anatoly, gun down the others and incinerate their corpses before exiting, just seconds before the arrival of Superman, who crashes into Lois's cell and saves her. The actions of Anatoly and his men, though, have made it appear to some that Superman was behind the various murders in Naromi, causing even more debate over whether or not he can be trusted. And so, Senator June Finch, who also heads the committee tasked with investigating the activities of Superman, declares that Superman will be held responsible for his actions. The ones who were actually behind what went down in Naromi, meanwhile, although not currently being investigated by the government, are still being looked into as well by Batman, who originally had been looking into a target only known as the White Portuguese that was looking to transport a dirty bomb into Gotham. But after multiple criminal beatdowns and brandings, he managed to connect Anatoly to the target, who, after hacking into the mercenary's phone, he learns is working for Lex Luthor, one of, if not the smartest individual in the world, and CEO of one of the world's largest multinational corporations, LexCorp Industries. Luthor's employment of Anatoly doesn't just stop at the White Portuguese though, as he was also the one behind what went down in Naromi, which he'd set up to intentionally ruin Superman's image and expose him as a fraud, although Bruce isn't aware of this at the moment. Conveniently, shortly following Bruce's discovery of Lex's involvement with the White Portuguese, he actually receives an invitation to attend a fundraiser hosted by Luthor. And so, Bruce attends the event and sneaks his way down to LexCorp's servers, per Alfred's directions via earpiece, which happened to be overheard by Clark Kent, also in attendance on behalf of the Daily Planet. Previously, Clark had learned for the first time about the Batman's brand of justice, and of how he's begun literally branding his victims, none of which Clark seems to be a fan of. And now, after overhearing Bruce and Alfred's conversation, he's deduced that Bruce Wayne is the Batman himself. So, he approaches Bruce and asks for his thoughts on Batman, until the two are almost immediately interrupted by Luthor coming to greet them, allowing Bruce the chance to slither away and retrieve the drive on which he downloaded the LexCorp data. But he finds it no longer there, and instead in the possession of who we recognize as Diana Prince. It doesn't take long for Bruce to discover her identity as well, as he later tracks her down at the Gotham City Museum of Antiquities, and asks that she return what she stole, which she'd already planned on doing since she'd failed to get past the data's military-grade encryption, and wasn't able to find what she was looking for. So, Bruce then takes the drive back to the Batcave and begins the decryption process, during which he falls asleep and finds himself in what appears to be a nightmare future, being attacked and incapacitated by soldiers and parademons before awakening in a cave to be met by Superman, who blames Bruce for letting Lois die and begins tearing out his heart, which jolts him awake, or so it appears, as this is actually another vision of who appears to be Barry Allen, claiming that Lois Lane is the key and imploring him to find us, before Bruce finally wakes up with the decryption complete. Through LexCorp's data, Bruce is finally able to uncover that the White Portuguese is actually a ship, and that the dirty bomb is really a rock of kryptonite, which was found earlier near the ruins of Zod's world engine in the Indian Ocean, and which we learned through Luthor, who'd been given access to Zod's body in the crashed Fortress of Solitude to conduct research, that the kryptonite happens to be capable of wounding a Kryptonian. So Lex is now looking to transport the rock into Gotham and use it to create a Superman deterrent. Bruce, though, doesn't believe Luthor's doing this to actually protect the people of Earth, and so he prepares to steal the kryptonite for himself, so that he, not wanting the future he dreamt up to become a reality, can take Superman down as the Batman. His attempt to intercept the ship is interrupted, though, by Superman, who's arrived to put an end to Batman's brutal way of doing things, ordering him not to answer the call the next time he sees his light in the sky. But this just fuels Batman's hatred even more. Outside of Batman, Superman's also still been dealing with the public slowly turning against him, as they begin to recognize how his destructive efforts to help have damaged many people's lives, including the previously mentioned Wallace Keefe, who blames losing his job, his family, and use of his legs following the Battle of Metropolis solely on Superman, and makes his frustrations public by vandalizing the recently built Superman statue and spray painting the words "False God" on it, resulting in his arrest. He's soon bailed out, though, by none other than Lex Luthor, who sees Wallace as a perfect tool to further damage the perception of the Kryptonian hero, fitting him with a brand new wheelchair and getting him a meeting with Senator Finch, who Wallace begs to bring him face to face with the man who ruined his life. And she immediately looks to make that happen, demanding on the news that Superman meet at the US Capitol to explain himself. So Clark decides to ease the people's minds and answer whatever questions Finch's committee has for him at the Capitol the following day. But before he or anyone else can say anything, Wallace's wheelchair suddenly explodes as a result of Lex having planted a bomb inside of it, killing everyone in the courtroom other than Superman, and causing questions of his involvement in the massacre to be raised, just as Lex had hoped. This explosion at the Capitol also proves to be enough for Bruce Wayne, who's pushed over the edge once again and decides it's time to eliminate Superman once and for all. So he steals the kryptonite from LexCorp and creates his own weaponry with it with Alfred's help. And while that process is underway, Bruce decides to again look through the LexCorp data he downloaded, eventually stumbling upon a file titled Metahuman, and finding what Diana had been looking for, which turns out to be a photo taken of her, Steve, Charlie, Samir, and Chief during World War I. Also within this metahuman file, Bruce uncovers footage of 3 other super beings Lex had found living on Earth. The first of which being Barry Allen, who's seen using his super speed to stop a corner store robbery, the second being of a now adult Arthur Curry wielding a trident in the ocean, and the third of Victor Stone's transformation into a cyborg, all of which he sends to Diana, along with her photograph. Once his kryptonite weapons are complete, Bruce then suits up in an armored Batman suit and waits beside the bat signal for Superman's arrival. But Clark's far too occupied at the moment to worry at all about stopping Batman, as both his mother and Lois are kidnapped by Lex Luthor, the latter of whom Lex uses to draw Superman's attention by throwing her off the rooftop of his building to be caught by the hero. And once finally face to face with him, Lex reveals his plans of proving to the world and to Superman himself that he, nor any perceived god, can possibly be all-powerful and all-good, informing Clark that, if he wants to save his mother, he'll have to bring him Batman's head. So Clark travels over to Gotham City with hopes that he can convince Batman to help. But Bruce instead immediately unleashes an attack against him, firing 2 kryptonite gas grenades directly at Superman, which severely weakens him and allows Batman to gain full control in their battle, repeatedly slamming him through an abandoned building and thwarting any attempt to fight back with another kryptonite gas grenade, before looking to end their fight and Superman for good with a kryptonite spear. As Batman goes to drive the spear through his chest, Superman uses his final moments to beg that he save his mother Martha, stopping Bruce in his tracks as he flashes back to his own mother of the same name's death. And understanding the love for and loss of a mother personally, Bruce decides to spare Clark's life and goes to save Martha himself, who he quickly locates before taking down and killing a bunch of Luthor's men, including Anatoly, en route to their escape. While he does that, Superman travels back to the Fortress of Solitude to confront Lex, although it's soon revealed that Luthor has yet another trick up his sleeve, as earlier, while experimenting with Zod's body, he used its fingerprints to gain access to the ship's Genesis chamber, in which he was able to learn from the Kryptonian archives about all of Krypton's history, including of a creature forbidden by the Council of Krypton that was only known as the Desecration Without Name, that he learned he could create using Zod's corpse and a blood sacrifice. And so he went ahead with the ritual and has now created the creature to serve as Superman's doomsday. The two's huge battle travels all throughout Metropolis and back into Gotham, where Superman receives some assistance from Batman as well as Wonder Woman, who decided to come and help after seeing all the destruction the fight was causing, and the 3 do their best to wound the beast, while also searching for Batman's kryptonite spear that could actually take the monster down. And thanks to some help from Lois Lane, Superman's able to locate the weapon and prepares to fly it straight into Doomsday, which, despite it making him weaker and weaker, he successfully manages to do. Although his weakened state leaves him open to one final blow from the creature, as he's fatally pierced through the chest and killed. Following the battle, Lex Luthor's involvement in everything that took place is uncovered by the authorities, who have him arrested and sent to Belle Reve, where he's later met by Batman and reminded that he'll be watching every move he makes going forward. But Lex says that soon there will be others for him to worry about now that the god is dead, and hints he may actually know who this new threat is. We also see a funeral ceremony for Superman, which Bruce and Diana both attend, and Bruce, looking to honor Superman and make things right, suggests they find and bring together others like him. Bruce Wayne isn't the only one seeking to put together a team to fight on Earth's behalf now that Superman's gone though, as the previously mentioned Amanda Waller is looking to do something similar with a few of those we've seen get sent away to Belle Reve, along with other beings like the one soon discovered in Peru by archaeologist Dr. June Moon, who, while searching through a cave, comes across and opens a doll-shaped container, which inadvertently releases the previously locked away Enchantress, who promptly possesses her. Once Waller becomes aware of the Enchantress now inhabiting June's body, she sends one of the US's finest Special Forces officers, Colonel Rick Flag, to locate and watch over the Doctor, and also sends another team to search the cave in which she turned up to collect the witch's heart, as being in possession of her heart gives Waller full control over her, and in turn Dr. Moon, who, throughout this time spent under Flag's watch, actually falls in love with him, and vice versa. So, holding Enchantress's heart in her back pocket not only puts the witch and Moon under her command, but now Flag as well. Another metahuman also soon catches Waller's attention, named Chato Santana, aka El Diablo, who was born with pyrokinetic powers that he's since used to his advantage in the criminal underworld, until, soon enough, his days running the streets catch up to him, as his wife, Grace, although aware of his life as a gangbanger, grows furious after finding a stash of weapons and money in their family home. So, not wanting her kids anywhere near this kind of business, she prepares to send them over to her mom's house, but Diablo refuses to let his kids be taken from their home, before the argument escalates to the point that he loses control of his anger, and in turn his powers, setting the house ablaze and killing his family as a result. Once realizing what he's done, Diablo calls the cops on himself and is sent to Belle Reve, where he spends the next few months until Waller's ready to form her new team, which she's labeled Task Force X. During her pitch of the idea at the Pentagon, we learn exactly who she plans on putting on the squad, including the previously mentioned Rick Flag, who will reluctantly be leading the group, Deadshot, Harley Quinn, Captain Boomerang, El Diablo, and Enchantress, as well as two other powerful beings that we haven't yet met, known as Killer Croc, real name Waylon Jones, and Slipknot, real name Christopher West, the former of whom was born with a form of regressive atavism resulting in reptilian traits and had been a regular foe of Batman prior to his incarceration, and the latter a highly skilled rope and wall climber. Her allies in the US government don't see how she could possibly control such dangerous individuals though, so Waller calls over June Moon and showcases her ability to control the Enchantress entity, which proves to be enough for them to give the project the green light. She doesn't have quite as much control over the witch as she thinks though, as later that night, June whispers Enchantress's name in her sleep, transforming her into the entity, who prevents Flag from calling for help by threatening him with a vision of June's death, allowing her to escape into Waller's hotel room, although she's unable to get anywhere near her heart due to an alarm built into the briefcase holding it that can detect her presence. But her attention soon turned elsewhere anyway when she hears the voice of her brother, Incubus, calling out for her, leading her to find that Waller also happens to be in possession of his containment vessel, which she scoops up before traveling down into the subway and unleashing his soul onto a random civilian. Having restored her brother's life, she tells him to build up his strength by feeding on the humans while awaiting her return, before then transforming back into June and returning to the hotel. Shortly following Enchantress's exit, Incubus unleashes an attack on those inside the subway, forcing Waller, with Task Force X not yet fully operational, to send just Flag and Moon over to the location of the attack in Midway City, with a plan for Enchantress to transport a bomb near the unknown being. But, upon being given control of the body by Moon, Enchantress runs off, prompting Waller to repeatedly stab her heart, although this fails to actually kill her, thanks to Incubus temporarily granting her some of his own power until she can regain possession of it. And so, Enchantress, now finally reunited with her brother, devises a plan to get revenge on the humans for locking them away all this time, and kill their entire race using a single machine of her own creation. With both Enchantress and Incubus on the loose, Task Force X is rushed into action, with each member being injected in the neck with a nanite explosive, so that, if any of them choose to go against Waller or Flag's orders, they could be immediately eliminated. Things are soon made even more complicated though, when it's revealed that the Joker may be plotting to interrupt their business. As earlier, we saw Joker's men capture one of Belle Reve's security guards, Hunter Griggs, who Joker was able to rather easily get the information he needed out of, and so he sent him back to Belle Reve with a phone for Harley, which he now covertly places in her hand. Also thanks to Griggs, Joker's able to locate where the nanite explosives were created, and so he and his goons head over to and attack Van Chris Laboratories en route to capturing the scientist who'd built them. Waller's team, meanwhile, just before heading off to Midway City, are actually joined by one final member, the samurai assassin known as Katana, whose late arrival can be attributed to her having just been in Japan, tracking down the man who'd watched her husband's murder unfold and killing him with the same sword that took her husband's life, the Soul Taker, which traps the soul of anyone it kills. Upon their arrival, the team is almost immediately cut down a member when Slipknot, having been convinced by Boomerang that the implants in their neck aren't actually explosives, attempts to make an escape. forcing Flag to promptly set off the explosive and kill him as they continue making their way towards the target, which no one but Flag has any clue about, but they soon realize what they're up against when they're suddenly attacked by Enchantress and Incubus's army, made up of humans that they'd converted into the Eye of the Adversary monsters, all of which the squad is ultimately able to take out before making their way over to Amanda Waller's safe house to meet with her and be given transport via helicopter. Their planned exit is promptly interrupted though by the Joker, who'd managed to hijack their chopper and opens fire on the group outside of Harley, who, once the scientist finishes disabling her implant, rushes towards the aircraft and makes her escape. But, unfortunately for her, her and Joker's reunion is short-lived, as Waller immediately orders an attack on the ship that sends Harley falling out of it and Joker crashing with it to his presumed death. Waller's then scooped up by her own chopper, claiming she'll send for another to pick up everyone else. But before she can do that, she gets sent crashing to the ground as well by an attack from Incubus, and is then captured by his and Enchantress's minions, along with Enchantress's heart. The team quickly rushes towards the wreckage of her aircraft, but ultimately arrive too late, with the only thing being found outside of the still-alive Harley is Waller's top-secret file binder, in which Deadshot learns of how this whole mess was actually Flag and Waller's faults to begin with. And so, he and the other criminals leave Flag on his own, opting to go get a drink instead. Flag also soon joins them and acknowledges the role he played in letting all of this happen, but refuses to stop now with the woman he loves stuck in the middle of it, and so he heads back out. Although before doing so, he also destroys the device controlling their implants, setting them all free. Deadshot decides against just returning to his life of crime though, seeing this potential victory as a perfect way to be seen as a hero by his daughter for once. And the others decide to take a shot at redemption as well by battling the two entities one more time, forming a plan to distract the villains while Killer Croc and a team of Navy SEALs swim down into a flooded subway tunnel and plant a bomb just beneath their location. They're nearly once again turned to the dark side though, as Enchantress tempts them with visions of what they most desire, with Deadshot seeing himself finally kill Batman, Harley imagining a normal life raising a family with the Joker, Flag living happily with June, and El Diablo being with his family again. But Diablo knows that their return still wouldn't change what he did, and so breaks free of his vision before fully embracing his power and unleashing an attack on Incubus, who is able to hold off long enough for the bomb to be planted just beneath them. And in order to keep him in position, Diablo allows himself to be killed in the explosion as well. The others then enter a battle with Enchantress, against whom they struggle mightily, but Harley's ultimately able to slice open her chest and grab hold of her heart, opening the door for them to then destroy her machine in a huge explosion. Fortunately for Flag, the defeat and death of the Enchantress doesn't also result in the death of June, who's finally freed from the entity as a result and able to reunite with Rick, before the group is then reunited with Waller, who comes out of the rubble with the device controlling their implants in hand, forcing them each to promptly return to Belle Reve, although with 10 years off their sentences and a few perks, such as Lawton being able to pay his daughter a few visits. But shortly following their return to prison, Belle Reve is suddenly attacked by who's revealed to be the still alive Joker and his gang, who break Harley out of her cell and return with her to Gotham. Another short while after this, Amanda Waller has yet another meeting about Task Force X, this time with Bruce Wayne, as she's hoping he could help her keep her involvement in the whole thing under wraps, and he agrees in exchange for the government's top secret metahuman files, claiming he's just looking to form some valuable friendships for his own protection. It appears Waller knows the real reason why he's seeking this information out though, hinting at his nightly excursions as the Batman. So Bruce threatens that, if she doesn't permanently shut down Task Force X, then he and his friends will do it for her. Bruce doesn't immediately do anything with this newly received information though, choosing to instead wait until a threat that requires their combined powers to arise, which ends up happening a bit sooner than he'd expected, as within Gotham City, he begins encountering parademons, one of which he eventually manages to capture in a net, resulting in a momentary struggle before the creature suddenly implodes, leaving behind an image picturing the 3 mother boxes burnt on the wall behind it, which Bruce had actually seen drawings of before in Luthor's notes. So he finally begins seeking out Earth's other exceptional beings, beginning with Arthur Curry, also known by some as the Aquaman, who Bruce travels all the way to a small town in Iceland to meet, but their meeting doesn't go as he'd hoped, with Arthur, despite being offered a hefty sum of money for his services, declining to help, as he's grown comfortable just being on his own. Before Bruce can even get the chance to meet with another one of his potential teammates, we're next forced to shift our focus for the first time in a long time over to Themyscira, as the Amazons have noticed strange activity coming from the mother box within their stronghold, which soon enough suddenly awakens, bringing forth the return of Steppenwolf to Earth, who's come to complete the Unity after all these years, with the planet now in a weaker state than ever following Superman's death. Upon his return, he and his parademons are quickly able to overpower the Amazons and escape with the first Mother Box, prompting Queen Hippolyta to try and warn her daughter of the coming conflict by firing an enchanted fiery arrow, known as the Arrow of Artemis, into the world of man, as it's used by the Amazons as a warning signal, and the fire succeeds in catching Diana's attention, who then meets with Bruce to warn him of what's coming as well. With the world in desperate need of heroes now more than ever, Diana aids Bruce in recruiting the others, with her attempting to track down Victor Stone while Bruce heads off to Central City to meet with Barry Allen, whose location he and Alfred were able to pinpoint through Barry's frequent prison visits to see his father. And it doesn't take much convincing to get Barry on their team, as he immediately agrees to help after learning Bruce is Batman. Victor, on the other hand, is much harder to locate, since there isn't any real evidence that he's even still alive, outside of the footage found in Luthor's data. But soon enough, he actually contacts them by hacking into the Batcave's computer, as he'd become aware of their attempts to track him thanks to his ability of technological manipulation. But unfortunately, Victor refuses to join them, still preferring to remain hidden. He's soon forced into action though, after his father, Silas, is suddenly kidnapped, along with many of his co-workers and employees, by Steppenwolf's parademons during their search for the Mother Box, while Steppenwolf himself has gone off to retrieve the Mother Box under the Atlanteans' protection. Although his attempt is nearly thwarted by Arthur, who just so happened to be swimming by during the battle, but Steppenwolf's ultimately able to subdue him and a few Atlantean soldiers en route to escaping with the second box. Following their defeat, Arthur's approached by Princess Mara of the Zebel Kingdom, who informs him that she actually knew and had a very close bond with his mother prior to her banishment from the kingdom, and that if Atlanta were still here, it would be her responsibility to pursue and stop Steppenwolf. But with her gone, it's now Arthur's as her firstborn son. Meanwhile, back on the surface, Bruce, shortly following his return to Gotham City with Barry, notices the bat signal shining in the sky. And so he, Barry, and Diana answer the call, revealed to have been made by a longtime ally of Batman, Commissioner Jim Gordon of the Gotham Police Department, who's recently received some information about the Star Labs kidnapping that he thought Batman would find useful. And during this meeting, the team's also suddenly joined by Victor, since his father's now involved. Using Gordon's information, the team's able to track Steppenwolf and his army to a tunnel near Gotham Harbor, where they've gathered up and begun interrogating the hostages, a few of whom have already been killed by Steppenwolf. But before Silas can suffer the same fate, Victor comes flying in to protect him, while Diana comes flying straight into Steppenwolf, resulting in a huge battle, with Wonder Woman and Batman taking on Steppenwolf and his army, while Victor and Barry usher the civilians to safety. In the midst of the battle, Batman, to gain an advantage, enters his Nightcrawler vehicle the team had arrived in and looks to fire a missile at Steppenwolf. But their attempt ends up failing, as Steppenwolf manages to effortlessly catch the missile and instead send it straight into the tunnel wall, causing water to quickly flood in while he and his parademons escape through a portal. But before the heroes can be swept away by the water, it's fortunately stopped by Aquaman, who's decided to finally join the fight. With the team now just about fully formed, they regroup in the Batcave, where Victor also brings the final Mother Box and explains the level of power it holds. And Bruce, upon learning of the box's capabilities, begins to ponder the possibility of them using it, combined with the Fortress of Solitude's Genesis Chamber, to bring Superman back to life, as he believes this League of Heroes may not be enough to defeat Steppenwolf without him. So he proposes the idea to the others, which, after some debating, they eventually agree to move forward with. Next, digging up Superman's corpse before breaking into the Fortress of Solitude and laying his body in the waters of its Genesis Chamber. They then go ahead with their experiment, dropping the box into the water and having Barry use his super speed to conduct an electrical current and awaken it the exact moment it comes in contact with it. And it appears to have been a success, with Superman suddenly flying up and out of the ship. Although, unfortunately, he doesn't immediately remember anything from his past and assumes the heroes surrounding him are threats, and so attacks them, resulting in a huge brawl that's eventually resolved following the arrival of Lois Lane, who Bruce had sent Alfred to get in case this sort of scenario played out, and she's quickly able to calm Clark and remind him of his past life. The hero's short scuffle, though, allowed Steppenwolf the perfect opportunity to retrieve the third and final Mother Box, and so he now begins forming the Unity in an abandoned Russian nuclear power plant. But the heroes luckily arrive just in time to prevent its completion, and ultimately their combined powers leave Steppenwolf stricken with fear, which turns his parademons against him, and he's again forced to leave Earth as the creatures pile on, With the day saved, the heroes return to their individual lives, although remain prepared to one day team up again if Earth may ever need them to. And this new alliance between them proves pretty beneficial for each of them. In particular for Barry, who, thanks to a recommendation from Bruce, is able to get a job in the Central City Police Department's crime lab, bringing him one step closer to possibly exonerating his father one day. Things aren't all great though, as we soon learn that Lex Luthor had somehow managed to escape prison, as he's now seen on his yacht meeting with another enemy of Batman and one of the world's deadliest assassins, Slade Wilson, aka Deathstroke, to whom Lex proposes the idea that they form a league of their own to counter the Justice League. In the year following the Justice League's team-up, we head down into the ocean as a team of pirates, led by Jesse Kane and his son David, are hijacking a Russian nuclear submarine, although this is soon interrupted by the arrival of Aquaman, who rams himself into the sub and lifts it above water, before then entering and swiftly subduing the pirates to free the Russians still trapped inside. But while doing that, he's attacked by Jesse and David, both of whom he ultimately makes quick work of before attempting to leave the ship, although that's once again interrupted when Jesse shoots a rocket at him, which Arthur manages to dodge, resulting in it instead making contact with the sub and leaving a hole that causes the ship to begin flooding. The force of the water also subsequently causes a torpedo to crush Jesse's legs, leaving him trapped with David unable to help him, so the latter begs Arthur to help free his father, but Arthur decides against it since they just killed innocent people and exits, before David's then forced to leave his father after Jesse arms himself with a grenade, while urging his son to leave quickly so he can survive to one day kill Aquaman. And so he does as the grenade goes off and Jesse is killed. A short while later, we're introduced to a few Atlanteans, including the current king of Atlantis and second son of Queen Atlanna, King Orm, and King Nereus of the Zebul Kingdom, as the two discuss the possibility of engaging in a war against the surface world, as Orm believes they're becoming too big of a threat and could destroy their home. But Nereus reminds Orm that by law, he'll need 4 of the 7 kingdoms to join together in order to ascend and attack, and believes that, with the Lost Nation and Deserter Kingdoms having long perished, and the Trench being nothing but animals, they will be unable to do so, as the other 2 remaining kingdoms, the Brine and the Fishermen, would never join Atlantis. Nereus is also suspicious of Orm's real motives, believing that he just wants to become Ocean Master, thereby becoming the commander of the greatest military might on the planet. But, although that could be true, it appears Orm's fear of the surface world may be justified as well, as they're suddenly attacked by a Russian nuclear submarine that Orm manages to make quick work of, destroying the sub with his trident that had been passed down to him by his father. And this attack proves to be enough to convince Nereus to join forces with Atlantis. King Nereus' daughter and the arranged fiancée of King Orm, Princess Mara, though, isn't in support of the war they're planning, and so, in an attempt to bring an end to Orm's rule before he can move ahead with it, heads up to the surface and again approaches Arthur Curry, to whom she explains Orm's plans, as well as that, with him being the firstborn son of Queen Atlanna, the throne is his birthright. And so, if he can find the lost trident of Atlan and gain its powers to command the sea, then the people will listen to him and he could dethrone Orm. Arthur, though at first refusing to help or ever be king of Atlantis, does soon change his mind following a huge water attack from Orm and his army that nearly drowns his father, but is ultimately stopped by Mara, using her powers of water manipulation to shield them and remove the water from Tom's lungs. So, with Arthur now joining Mara in this fight, she next sneaks him into Atlantis, where he's then reunited with Noita's Vulko, who's also against Orm's war with the surface world, and who hands Arthur an ancient recording that he believes contains Atlan's final message to his people and the location of the sacred trident. They no longer have the technology to play the recording though, so Vulko says that he'll need to take it to the Deserter Kingdom. But before he can, they're suddenly attacked by Atlantean soldiers, and although Vulko and Mara are able to escape unseen with the cylinder, Arthur is arrested for illegal entry and brought before King Orm, who Arthur promptly challenges for the throne in a combat of the kings, and Orm accepts, under the agreement that if he wins, the war will go on as planned. So they battle in front of all of Atlantis, and although Arthur does his best to defeat his half-brother, he proves to be no match, as Orm eventually slices Arthur's trident in half and prepares to kill him. But just before he does, Mara pushes Orm back with a blast of water, and helps Arthur escape back to the surface. After a relatively short journey on land, the two eventually make it to the remains of the Deserter Kingdom beneath the Sahara Desert, where they find the Hall of Armory where Atlan's trident was forged, and there they're able to play the recording, in which Atlan had given clues as to where they could find his trident that eventually lead the two on a path to the Kingdom of the Trench. Just as they begin their journey to the Trench though, they're again suddenly attacked by Atlantean soldiers, this time along with David Kane, now going by the Black Manta. As earlier, it was revealed that King Orm had worked with David to fake the submarine attack, and following the betrayal of Mera and her escape with Arthur, Orm met with Kane again to gift him prototype Atlantean armor so that he could kill them, since Orm himself was forced not to kill his fiancée by Nereus. But again, Black Manta is defeated by Arthur and knocked off of a cliff to his presumed death, while Mera takes out the Atlantean soldiers. Arthur and Mera then move ahead with their journey, eventually making it past the creatures of the trench and into the hidden sea, where they're shocked to find Atlanta, who'd miraculously managed to survive there for 20 years, and, after immediately embracing her son, reveals that the reason she'd never gone back home to him is because the portal that brought them here doesn't allow them to return. So, their only way back is for Arthur to retrieve Atlan's trident, but to do that, he must get past the Carathan, a giant sea creature with immense power that has guarded the trident against even the greatest champions for 1,000 years. Once confronted by the Carathan, though, Arthur's ability to communicate with it shocks the creature, as it hasn't communicated with a mortal since King Atlan, and Arthur explains that, although he doesn't believe he's worthy, he must retrieve the trident, as it's its only hope to save his home and the people he loves. So the Carathan allows him to make an attempt at freeing the trident from Atlan's hands, claiming he can only do so if he really is worthy. And, fortunately, he's proven so, retrieving the trident and gaining the power to command the sea, including the Carathan and the trench. So he, Mera, Atlanta, and his army of the sea intercept the Atlantean, Zebul, and Fisherman armies while they attempt to force the Brine Kingdom to join them, resulting in a huge battle during which Mera finds her father, and, upon revealing that Arthur wields the trident, Nereus, the fisherman, and his army stand down. Arthur, meanwhile, brings Orm to the surface, and they have a very close back-and-forth battle, but eventually, Arthur's able to overpower Orm and snap his trident. Orm, having clearly lost, begs his half-brother to kill him, as mercy is not the Atlantean way. But Arthur decides not to, before Atlanta joins them, and, after embracing Orm, explains to him that the land and the sea are one, so no more blood needs to be shed. Before Orm's then arrested by Vulko and imprisoned on Atlantis, while its people hail their new king. And, following the battle, Atlanta is finally able to have her long-awaited reunion with Tom. Also, elsewhere on land, we see that Black Manta managed to survive the earlier battle, as he's found by a marine biologist obsessed with Aquaman in Atlantis, Dr. Stephen Shin, who patches up Manta's wounds and asks him how he got his Atlantean armor. But before Manta answers, he demands to know where to find Aquaman. Jumping ahead a few months now, as we're taken to Philadelphia to be reintroduced to Billy Batson, who's seen luring a couple police officers into a pawn shop and locking them inside so that he can use their police computer to search for the home address of Rachel M. Batson, one of many Batsons that he's tracked down in hopes that one would turn out to be his mother. But upon arriving at the woman's home, it turns out once again not to be her. He's then picked up by the cops and taken to meet with a social worker, who, despite the fact that he's now run away from foster homes in 6 counties, has found another couple that runs a group home willing to take him in. So he heads home with said couple, Victor and Rosa Vasquez, and they introduce him to the rest of the kids, Eugene, Darla, Mary, Pedro, and Freddie, the latter of whom he'll be sharing a room with and whom we learn is a huge fan of superheroes, specifically Superman. The couple also enrolls Billy into school with the other kids, but he mostly tries to avoid them throughout the day, despite Freddie's attempts to get to know him. Although he's eventually convinced to come to their aid upon witnessing Freddie being attacked by a couple of bullies, Brett and Burke Breyer, who Billy, after they make fun of Freddie for not having a mom, attacks with Freddie's walking crutch, prompting them to chase him into the subway station, but he manages to make it onto a train just before they can catch him. While on the train though, he begins seeing a strange series of 7 symbols, before then suddenly being transported into the Rock of Eternity. Before we get into why that is, let's first meet back up with Thaddeus Savannah, who, since his encounter with Shazam over 40 years ago, has begun working for his father's company, Savannah Industries, and funding a project that he's claimed was to study mass hysteria, but in actuality has just been his attempt to find his way back to the Wizard's Cave. And finally, he's now learned that he could return through a doorway with the 7 symbols written on it 7 times. So he does just that, and once back in the cave, he confronts a now much weaker Shazam and grabs hold of the Eye of Sin, which promptly releases the 7 deadly sins from their stone prisons, who enter the ball and give Thaddeus use of their power by entering his right eye, which he then uses to incapacitate Shazam. So, in desperate need of a champion, the Wizard has now transported Billy here, who he gives a quick history lesson on his previous champion and of his subsequent vow to never pass on his magic until he found one truly good person, which he believes he's finally discovered with Billy. Billy disagrees with the wizard's belief, but still follows his orders, grabbing hold of his staff and saying Shazam to allow his power to flow through him, before the wizard then turns to dust and crumbles to the ground, and Billy's transported back onto the train in his superhero form. Billy, having no clue what to do about any of this, then heads back home and finds Freddy, hoping he can help him understand this superhero stuff. And Freddy, after having him prove he actually is Billy, helps him learn to control some of his power, which they learn includes electrokinesis, hyperspeed, super strength, and bullet immunity, before eventually returning home, where Billy also inadvertently learns that saying the wizard's name again will revert him back to his kid form. Back to Dr. Sivana now though, as the next morning he returns to Sivana Industries to confront his father, who we see had survived his previous accident but is now paralyzed from the waist down, while he's in a meeting with the company's board members, which includes Thad's brother Sid, who Thaddeus launches out the window before unleashing the 7 deadly sins on the rest of the board, leaving just his father alive so he can gloat about his unequal amount of power. But his gloating soon interrupted, as the sins inform him that the wizard has chosen his champion, so he leaves Greed to kill his father while he exits in search of said champion, who's again testing out his powers with Freddy, while also documenting and uploading their experiments to YouTube, which helps Billy's Shazam form rise in popularity. Freddy starts getting a little too comfortable with his new superhero best friend though, as after being bullied again by the Brayers, he informs them of his friendship with the hero and claims he'll bring him to lunch the next day, which upsets Billy since they'd agreed to keep his relationships hidden in case he encountered a supervillain, and leads to a heated argument between the two that ultimately results in Billy standing Freddy up at lunch, and instead heading off to take photos with fans. Freddy later finds him though, and runs him down for turning into nothing more than a show-off and a bully, before storming off. And as he exits, Billy's then met and attacked by Dr. Sivana, who drags him by the throat all the way up into the sky before attempting to drop him to the ground. But Billy fortunately manages to avoid crashing thanks to his ability to fly. Still, he continues to be pursued by Thaddeus, until Billy just manages to escape by reverting back to his kid form and blending in with the other civilians. Thaddeus, though, soon learns of his secret identity through Freddy, who he saw on the news arguing with the champion, and here's now calling Billy's name. So he kidnaps and threatens Freddy to take him to Billy, who's now made it back home, where he's promptly confronted by his foster parents for all his running around and skipping school, while the rest of the kids watch the news and see the same footage Thaddeus saw before, which leads Mary to put 2 and 2 together and realize that Billy is Shazam. So the kids approach Billy about this, but he claims he doesn't plan on being a superhero anymore and prepares to run away again. But before he does, the kids reveal that they've tracked down his parents, whose names they've learned are Marilyn and CC Batson, the latter of whom's been in a Florida prison for the last 10 years, while his mom's actually 2 subway stops away. So he rushes off to her location, while Victor and Rosa try to follow after him. But just after they leave, the kids are met at the home by Sivana. Billy, meanwhile, quickly finds his mom within her apartment complex and reveals that he's her lost son. She doesn't seem too thrilled about his arrival though, as it turns out she actually purposely left him that day. She explains that she got pregnant with him when she was only 17 and as a result was kicked out of her home, while his father decided he wanted nothing to do with him. So she was forced to take care of him alone, and she struggled with the life of a teen mom. So when they lost each other in the crowd that day, she decided that he'd be better off being raised by someone else. And although she's glad to see he's done well since then, she says now is still not a great time for her. So he leaves, claiming he has to get back to his real family, who he soon learns are in danger when he receives a call from Freddy about Sivana, who he flies back home to confront. And once he's arrived, Thaddeus demands he turn over his powers, and threatens to harm the kids if he doesn't. So he agrees and follows him through a doorway back to the Rock of Eternity, where Sivana then picks up the wizard's staff and surrounds Billy with the 7 deadly sins, who order him to take the staff and say the champion's name. But just then, the other kids show up and launch Freddy's Batarang at the back of Thaddeus' head, which proves distracting enough to allow their and Billy's escape, with them attempting to hide within the crowd of the town's winter carnival. But Billy's soon forced to come out of hiding when Thaddeus just begins attacking everyone in attendance, which ultimately allows him and the Sins to round up the kids, leaving Billy presumably no other choice but to relinquish his power. However, Billy instead manages to use the staff against Thaddeus and knock him down, before then having each of the kids grab hold of it and shout Shazam, which grants them each powers just like him. before he then breaks the staff in half so that no one else can use it, and the family, with their newfound power, manages to fight off the Sins en route to Billy tearing the eye out of Sivana's head, and once again trapping the Sins in stone within the Rock of Eternity. With Thaddeus defeated and the Sins once again imprisoned, the kids are then able to return to their lives, with Freddy still having to deal with the embarrassment of his superhero best friend not showing up at school like he said he would. Although, not for long, as the rest of the kids have arranged for Billy to show up as Shazam and announce to the whole school that Freddy is indeed his best friend, as well as introduce him to his favorite superhero. Speaking of Justice League members, strangely one day in 2020, Barry Allen finds himself being suddenly transported to what looks to be another universe, in which he's met by another variant of himself known in this world as the Flash, a name our Barry soon adopts as well. Despite this other Flash appearing pretty distressed about some sort of catastrophic event though, our Barry isn't able to offer much help, as he's promptly sent back to the main DC universe just as quickly as he'd left it. Next, we return once again back to Gotham, just as the previously mentioned Helena Bertinelli also makes her return to the city, as she, after 15 years of vigorous training to become a skilled assassin, specifically with a crossbow in her hands, now looks to finally take down those who killed her family under the alias Huntress, starting with the head of the Galante crime family, Stefano Galante. As Helena begins marking names off her kill list, elsewhere in Gotham, we also get the chance to meet back up with Harley Quinn and the Joker, who, following her escape from Belle Reve about 4 years ago, had returned to their roles as king and queen of Gotham's criminal underworld. At least, that was until Joker decided he'd had enough of and subsequently broke up with her. Although devastated by the breakup, Harley manages to hide her sadness from the rest of Gotham, as she's decided to instead keep the end of her and Joker's relationship a secret, as to not lose all the perks and immunity that came with being his girlfriend, and allowed her to do whatever she wanted, like breaking some guy's legs for giving her an attitude. This guy whose legs she'd just broken though, happened to be the driver for the nightclub's owner, Roman Sionis, who, although not showing it, is incredibly irritated by Harley's behavior. But since as far as he knows, she's still the Joker's girl, he refrains from doing anything about it, and keeps his composure thanks to the soothing voice of his nightclub's performing artist, and who he calls his little bird, Dinah Lance, also known as Black Canary. Although, she doesn't appear to share the same admiration for him, with her immediately heading to the bar after her set. There, she meets Harley, who struggles to contain her sadness any longer, and finally opens up about her breakup with the Joker, which, unfortunately, ends up being overheard by a male bar patron, who, after Lance's exit, looks to take advantage of Harley's drunken state, along with his friend. But, as they're putting her in the back of their truck, Lance, thankfully, comes to her aid, and proves to be more than just a singer, landing a flurry of kicks and strikes to knock the two out, all of which is seen from inside by Roman, who, upon witnessing the showcase of her abilities, decides to appoint her as his new driver, a job she didn't at all want. Jumping ahead about a week now to see yet another of Huntress's revenge murders, with her target this time being mob boss Carlo Rossi, who she confronts while he's out with 4 of his men for dinner, each of whom she impressively manages to gun down before firing an arrow straight into Rossi's throat so he can suffer a slow and painful death. She's then quickly able to escape unseen before detectives Tim Monroe and Renee Montoya arrive, the latter of whom, we learn, broke a career-making case around 10 years ago, but despite that, is still stuck at detective level, due to her partner at the time, who's now her boss, taking all the credit. The two's investigation here is soon interrupted though, as not too far from the restaurant where the shooting took place, there's a sudden explosion at Ace Chemicals thanks to Harley Quinn, who'd been out getting drinks with who she thought were her friends. But after overhearing them making fun of her obsession with the Joker, she decided it was time to officially sever ties with him, and believed the best way to do this was to drive a truck straight into the place where it all began. By the time Montoya and other officers arrive, Harley's already fled the scene, with the only thing she left behind being the J necklace Joker had gifted her.
Harley Quinn just called open season on herself.
Harley's not currently Montoya's main concern though, as she's more intrigued with the crossbow killer and their connection to Roman Sionis, who she'd already been looking into with help from her informant, Roman's previous driver. But since he's no longer working for Roman, she now heads over to Dinah Lance's apartment in hopes that they can work out a similar working relationship, which ultimately doesn't end up happening. Roman, meanwhile, is soon informed of Harley and Joker's breakup from his right-hand man, Victor Zsasz, and promptly sends some of his men to go and find her, while also sending Victor and Dinah on a different job to retrieve the Bertinelli diamond. which, after all these years, he's finally managed to track down. So the two do just that, and after Victor demands he be the one to hold on to it, Dinah heads back to her car, and while doing so, catches a young girl trying to pickpocket her named Cassandra Cain, who we saw earlier actually lives in the same apartment building as Lance. Despite Dinah scolding her for her actions, Cassandra still continues stealing from basically everyone she passes, and she turns out to actually be really good at it, even managing to pickpocket the diamond off of Victor before she's eventually spotted by the cops while pickpocketing someone else and arrested, prompting her to just swallow the diamond as to not have to hand it over. Roman's furious upon learning they'd allowed a little girl to steal his diamond from him, but he does his best to calm down ahead of Harley Quinn's murder, who his men had managed to capture and bring back to his nightclub. So he takes a front row seat to watch as Victor prepares to kill her, but she just manages to avoid death for now by offering him some help with his lost diamond situation, saying that if he lets her live, she'll, in return, find Cassandra Cain and get him the diamond. And he decides to give her till midnight to do so. Although, to make things interesting, he also decides to place a $500,000 bounty for Cassandra's capture. This decision to target Cassandra, though, doesn't sit right with Dinah, and so, in an attempt to protect her, she calls Montoya and tries to warn her that someone's coming after Cass. Although, the call ends up being just a bit too late, as Harley's already arrived and begun shooting up the police station, en route to finding and escaping with Cass. Upon learning Cassandra had swallowed the diamond, Harley decides to take her back to her place while they wait for her to poop it out. And while there, the two pretty quickly take a liking to one another. But, despite their blossoming friendship, Harley still feels she has no other choice but to turn Cass over to Roman, unable to handle so many people gunning for her. So she calls him up and plans the exchange at an abandoned funhouse called the Booby Trap, which Roman once again sends Dinah and Victor to take care of. Although, Dinah's worried that, even after they retrieve the diamond, Roman and Victor may still look to harm Cass, so she texts Montoya the location of the exchange, which ends up also being seen by Victor, who then informs Roman of Dinah's betrayal, prompting Roman to don the black mask and make his way to the funhouse as well. The first to arrive at the booby trap, though, is Montoya, who immediately attacks Harley, but the latter ultimately gets the better of their exchange, sending Renee flying out the window with a huge kick, before subsequently being dropped herself by a tranquilizer dart to the neck from Victor, entering with Dinah, who quickly finds Cassandra duct-taped to a toilet. As she goes to cut her free, though, Victor demands she cut open Cass's stomach instead, so she can prove her loyalty to Roman. But thankfully, before things can get to that point, Victor's suddenly shot in the neck by Huntress, whose arrow's driven in further by Dinah before he falls to the floor and is stabbed repeatedly by Harley with the tranquilizer dart. Following Victor's death, Montoya makes her way back into the room through the window, leading to a short-lived standoff between her and Huntress, with Renee still accusing her for working for Sionis. So, Helena reveals the purpose of her mission was to kill Galante and his firing squad, which it turns out included Victor's ass. And so, with them all dead, her job is finally done, or at least she thinks it is, until Roman and his army arrive outside. With them completely surrounded, Harley, seeing no way for them to make it out alive on their own, suggests they all work together, and they reluctantly agree, fighting alongside one another to make it out of the building. But, despite their efforts, Cassandra still ends up being captured by one of Sionis' men. So Dinah unleashes a sonic scream onto the rest of his army, so that Harley can make it through and follow after Cass and Roman all the way to the abandoned Founders Pier, where Harley, after wasting her last bullet, instead provides a distraction for Cass to plant a grenade in Sionis' suit, which, after Harley sends him flying off the pier, explodes and kills him. Having finally defeated Roman, the five women decide to go out for some tacos and margaritas, after which Cassandra finally poops out the diamond, enabling them to return the Bertinelli fortune to Helena, which she decides to use to fund her new team of vigilantes called the Birds of Prey, made up of her, Black Canary, and Renee Montoya, the latter of whom had decided to quit being a cop after her boss, once again, took credit for her work in capturing Roman's men. Meanwhile, Harley pawns the diamond itself so that she can start up Harley Quinn and Associates, alongside her apprentice, Cassandra Cain. Although their partnership, unfortunately, doesn't last very long, as sometime within the next few months, Harley ends up back in Belle Reve after crashing her car into a bank. Shortly following her return to Belle Reve, Harley's once again recruited for another Task Force X operation, with Waller's team this time comprising of Brian Derlin, also known as Savant, an expert hacker and marksman, a super soldier named Richard Hertz, aka Blackguard, an alien warrior from the planet Warworld named Mongol, a former German Olympic athlete turned criminal named Gunter Braun, aka Javelin, Corey Pitzner, aka the Detachable Kid, or TDK for short, who has the ability to detach his arms and telekinetically control them, a weasel-like humanoid serial killer named Weasel, and the returning Captain Boomerang and Rick Flag. The target for their mission, we learn, is actually the Jotunheim experimentation facility in Corto Maltese, as just a week ago, the Herrera family that had ruled over the nation for the past 100 years and worked with the US to fund Jotunheim's Project Starfish were publicly executed by General Silvio Luna and his right-hand man, General Mateo Suarez, in a violent military coup to take control of the Corto Maltese government. And with the nation now under a new regime, the US is left scrambling to cover up their part in the horrific project. So they look to employ their Suicide Squad to destroy every trace of it in Jotunheim. Amanda Waller doesn't fill the team in on a majority of these details though, specifically the US's involvement in all of this, and instead just claims that the project could be cataclysmic for Americans and must be terminated. Also unbeknownst to anyone on the team, it turns out Waller doesn't actually have any faith in them to complete this mission. And so she's put together a whole other Task Force X squad led by Robert Dubois, aka Bloodsport, who'd been trained and tortured by his father to kill from the moment he was born, and who'd ended up here in Belle Reve for putting Superman in the ICU with a kryptonite bullet. Although, before taking on the life of a criminal, we learn he'd also served on Special Forces with Rick Flag. Dubois originally didn't want anything to do with Waller's Suicide Squad, but after several failed attempts to sway him, she's now finally managed to, using his 16-year-old daughter Tyla's recent arrest for stealing, and threatening to have her tried as an adult. So, to prevent that from happening, Dubois agrees to lead her team. This second Task Force X consists of the previously mentioned Christopher Smith and Cleo Cazo, the former of whom, even after his brother's death, continued to be trained by his father to kill, and has now become known as Peacemaker, on a quest for peace no matter how many men, women, and children he has to kill to get it, while the latter, now going by Ratcatcher 2, had decided to move to America upon entering adulthood, and ended up in Belle Reve for attempting to rob a bank using her rat communicator. While the remaining two members of the team include Nanaue, aka King Shark, who's believed to be a descendant from an ancient shark god, and Abner Krill, aka Polka Dot Man, who, as a result of being exposed to an interdimensional virus by his mother, a scientist at Star Labs who is obsessed with turning her kids into superheroes, has developed a condition that causes him to grow multicolored polka dots that could eat him alive if he doesn't expel them from his body twice a day, and which also can be used as destructive projectiles. With both teams prepped for the mission, Waller has Team 1 dropped off on the South Beach, while Team 2's dropped off on the North Beach. And upon Team 1's arrival, they're immediately cut down a member after Weasel appears to drown in the ocean. And things are then made even worse when it's revealed that Blackguard had actually contacted and made a deal with the Corto Maltese army in hopes that they'd help him escape. But they instead shoot him in the face and proceed to kill everyone else in Team 1, outside of Harley and Flag, who are both surrounded and captured. And also surviving the battle, it turns out, is Weasel, who eventually regains consciousness once on shore and just runs off. Team 2, meanwhile, isn't met by a single Corto Maltese soldier thanks to Team 1 keeping them distracted, and so they begin their journey through the woods to the Corto Maltese capital, Valle del Mar, where Waller's ordered them to track down Gaius Greaves and force him to get them into Jotunheim. This mission is soon put on hold though, after one of Waller's employees, John Economos, manages to pinpoint Flag's location, so she sends the team there first to kill his captives and free him. Upon their arrival, the team, or more specifically Bloodsport and Peacemaker, gun down everyone they see, only to realize thereafter that Flag's captives are actually allies known as the Freedom Fighters, the resistance trying to take down Corto Maltese's new government, and who'd actually saved Flag from being captured by their army. Despite them having killed a bunch of her men, the Freedom Fighters' leader, Sol Soria, still agrees to help them apprehend Greaves, willing to do anything if it means stopping Luna and Suarez since they killed her entire family. Meanwhile, Harley Quinn, unlike Flag, was captured by the Corto Maltese army, and is now prepared for a meeting with Luna himself, who reveals that he and his people have actually admired her from afar for quite some time, and believe she'd make the perfect wife. So he asks her to marry him, and after spending the day together, she accepts. Those plans are quickly flipped on their head though, after Silvio reveals his desire to rid of anyone that opposes his rule using Project Starfish, no matter how young or old. which prompts Harley to suddenly shoot him in the chest, explaining that, after her breakup with the Joker, she'd promised herself that if she found any red flags in her next boyfriend, she'd kill them. And since he'd mentioned killing kids, she felt she needed to do just that. Her decision to murder Luna then immediately results in her once again being imprisoned, while Luna's position as president is promptly given to General Suarez. Shifting back to Task Force X, who, by now, have managed to make it into town and locate Greaves. But before having him lead them into Jotunheim, Flag, upon learning Harley's still alive and in Suarez's custody, has them change course momentarily to try and rescue her. Although it turns out that she doesn't actually need any help escaping, as she, while left alone with one of Suarez's guards for just a moment, manages to wrap her legs around and snap his neck, before then freeing herself from her chains and killing every other soldier in her path en route to exiting the building, where she soon stumbles upon Task Force X just as they were about to put their plan to save her into motion. So, with Harley freed, the team finally makes their way into Jotunheim, and after mowing through the building security out front, they lock the place down and begin planting bombs on each floor. While most of the team does that, Flag and Cleo have Greaves take them up to Project Starfish. And so they're introduced to Starro the Conqueror, as well as Greaves' many test subjects, each of whom have been killed and overtaken by extensions of the beast, which allow it to feed on their consciousness and grow larger and more powerful. Greaves, furious that 30 years of research is just going to be flushed down the drain, reveals in a hateful rant the United States government's involvement in everything that went down, leaving Flag in a state of shock, having been manipulated once again by Waller and the US. So, tired of covering up the government's dark secrets, Flag retrieves the hard drive containing all of Project Starfish's records, with plans of releasing this information to the public. But just then, he's suddenly held at gunpoint by Peacemaker, who reveals that, prior to their mission, Waller had personally ordered him to ensure that the project's records don't leave the building, a job he accepted to prevent an international incident and to keep the peace. Before either of the two can make their next move though, some of the explosives begin to go off early, which we see was the result of Polka Dot Man, while being shot at by Corto Maltese soldiers still in the building, inadvertently dropping some of the explosives and then unintentionally setting them off while firing polka dots at the guards. This explosion causes rubble to fall onto and knock out Peacemaker, Flag, Cleo, and Greaves, as well as causes the top half of the building to begin collapsing, resulting in Anaue crashing all the way to the ground below, a fall he fortunately survives, while Dubois, Harley, and Krill just manage to avoid falling as well, although Bloodsport, upon landing, they begin slamming down each floor. Meanwhile, Greaves and the others finally come to, and Greaves immediately realizes that the explosion had also destroyed the structure containing Starro, just before he's then grabbed and completely torn apart by the beast, while Flag's also promptly attacked upon regaining consciousness by Peacemaker, although Smith doesn't hold the control for long, as Flag begins choking the life out of him with a pipe. But ultimately, Smith just manages to grab hold of a shard on the floor and stab Flag directly in the heart, killing him, much to his own surprise. In the midst of the brawl though, the hard drive had fallen towards Cleo's direction, who now attempts to run off with it, but is quickly stopped by Smith. And, not wanting to leave behind any loose ends, he goes to kill her as well, before he's suddenly interrupted by Dubois crashing through the ceiling, who, upon realizing what's happening, aims and fires at Smith, simultaneously to Chris firing at him. But Dubois ends up getting the better of their exchange, with his bullet going straight through Peacemaker's and piercing his neck. This is then immediately followed by the emergence of Starro, who climbs up to the surface and promptly unleashes extensions of itself onto the Corto Maltese army, including Suarez, while Task Force X is able to avoid being overtaken by covering their faces. So Starro continues forward with its army towards the city, quickly leaving behind a path of destruction, which the team is ordered not to help stop by Waller, claiming it's not the US's problem. The team decides against following her orders though, so she prepares to set off the nanite explosives implanted in each of their necks, but is fortunately stopped by one of her employees, Flo Crawley, who knocks her out with a metal pipe, allowing the Suicide Squad to try and save the city. Things don't look too great initially though, with Polka Dot Man, after managing to burn through one of Starro's limbs by picturing the creature as his mom, being shockingly crushed and killed by the beast. But ultimately, the rest of the team, along with a ton of rats, manages to take the monster down for good. And so, with the city saved, Bloodsport once again speaks with Waller, and threatens that, if she ever decides to kill any of them or has his daughter incarcerated, he'll release the footage and data on the hard drive to the public. So she agrees to the deal and allows them to walk free. Not walking free though is Flo Crawley, who Waller promptly has arrested for knocking her out and going against her orders. Sometime later, we learn that, somehow, Peacemaker had survived Bloodsport's gunshot and Jotunheim's destruction, as two of Waller's employees, John Economos and Amelia Harcourt, are sent to visit him in the hospital in preparation for his and their next assignment. It isn't until around 5 months later, though, into 2021, that Chris is finally discharged from the hospital and able to return home, where he's almost immediately met by the previously mentioned Economos and Harcourt, along with mercenary Clemson Myrn and Waller's newest hire, Leota Adebayo, who also happens to be her daughter, although the rest of the team isn't aware of this fact, nor of the job Waller's secretly given her to plant some diary in Chris's trailer, while Adebayo appears to be unaware of just how cruel her mother can be. Since Chris had only served 4 years of his 30-year sentence, Myrn tells him that if he wants to avoid a return to Belle Reve or having his head blown up, then he'll once again have to work for them and Waller, this time as a contract killer for Project Butterfly, so Chris agrees. Ahead of their next meeting, Chris stops by his father's house to reunite with his pet/sidekick, Eagly, as well as pick up a few helmets his dad's built for him within his quantum unfolding storage chamber. Not because he cares about Chris though, but rather because he hopes Peacemaker will at least be able to kill some minorities while wearing it. At dinner, Chris is handed the file of their first target, US Senator Royland Goff, who Myrn claims is a serious threat to the safety of American citizens. And once finished eating, Harcourt decides to stop by a bar to wind down. But unfortunately for her, Chris follows her there and even proposes the two have sex, which she emphatically shuts down before storming off, leaving Chris to get it on with some other random girl at the bar named Annie Sturphausen instead. After sex though, Chris is then suddenly attacked by Annie, who proves to be shockingly powerful, eventually forcing Chris to leap out the window and make a run for his car, from which he retrieves his sonic boom helmet before setting it off to kill her. The cops then quickly pull up at the scene of the explosion, but fortunately, Harcourt and Adebayo arrive just in time to pick Chris up, and as Peacemaker makes his escape, Myrn and Economos head back to the team's headquarters so Economos can change the name on the registration of Chris's car and the fingerprints left at the scene, although he stupidly decides to change it to Chris's father, Augie Smith, who, as a result, ends up getting arrested for Annie's murder. Chris doesn't immediately learn of this, nor does the rest of the team decide to tell him, not only because they would lose his trust, but also because him being attacked by a butterfly was his fault to begin with, due to him having left Goff's file out in the open for Annie to read. So they send Chris home for now, where he has an emotional breakdown before being interrupted by a fellow morally gray crime fighter, and who claims to be Peacemaker's best friend, Vigilante, with whom, in an attempt to raise his spirits, Chris heads out to shoot and blow stuff up. The following day, the team heads off to see out Goff's assassination, and during the trip, Myrn informs Chris that, along with Goff, he may need to kill his wife and 2 kids if they also happen to be butterflies, which are still a mystery to Smith. And Chris, despite previously claiming he's willing to kill anyone of any age for peace, doesn't actually appear okay with the idea of killing kids. Still, he prepares to complete the mission, and the group awaits the opportunity to take Goff down outside of his family home, where it's also revealed that Vigilante had followed them there so he could keep an eye on and protect Chris, forcing them, as a result, to add him to the team since he knows all of what's going on. Eventually, the moment comes for Chris to take the shot, as the family sits down for dinner and eats a strange honey-colored goo with their abnormally long tongues, which Myrn claims is proof that they're all butterflies, so he orders Chris to take them out, but he just can't bring himself to kill the kids, and they're instead taken out by Vigilante, along with their mother, while his shot at Goff is thwarted just in the nick of time by Goff's 5-foot-tall bodyguard, Judo Master, who swiftly manages to knock out and kidnap Vigilante and Peacemaker. When they awaken, they find themselves tied up in Goff's basement, as Vigilante's unmasked for the first time and revealed to be the younger brother of Chris's old friend Gut Chase, Adrian Chase, before Adrian's then forced to endure some pretty intense torture. Fortunately though, Harcourt, Myrn, and Adebayo quickly make it into the house and set off an explosive down towards the basement that results in Chris being freed from his restraints and enables him to grab hold of Goff's shotgun to blow his head off. Much to Chris and Adrian's surprise, crawling out from Goff's head shortly thereafter is a literal alien butterfly, which Chris decides to capture, although he chooses against disclosing that information to the team for now. In addition to Chris capturing a butterfly, Economos had also managed to capture Judo Master, who had been sent by Goff to inform the others of what went down, but as he was leaving, he was suddenly crashed into by John. On top of all of this, the team's again forced to deal with having framed Chris's father, as Chris soon learns of Augie's imprisonment from a neighbor and prepares to visit him, leading Myrn to send Adebayo to try and stop him. But she fails to do so, and Chris's visit with his father goes just about as well as you'd expect, with Augie wishing he would have just killed him the day he was born, and claiming he plans to rat him out the next chance he gets. The team's unable to focus much more on the situation with Chris's father though, as they've just stumbled upon a connection between the Goff and Annie Stirphouse and Butterflies in the form of the Gland Thai Bottling Company. So Myrn sends the team over to the company's location to see what it's all about, and upon arriving at the facility, Peacemaker activates his X-ray helmet, allowing him to see who is and isn't a butterfly, every one of which he promptly shoots in the face, while Harcourt and Vigilante enter through the factory in the back of the building, where they're soon spotted and chased by the butterflies into their computer room, that's revealed to also contain a butterfly-controlled gorilla named Charlie, which attacks the two along with Peacemaker and Adebayo when they eventually arrive to help. And it appears for a moment that the beast may actually kill Chris, but fortunately, Economos shows up just in time with a chainsaw to put the gorilla down. Riding high on their victory, the team begins to genuinely bond on the ride home, singing and dancing along to 11th Street Kids by Hanoi Rocks, which happens to be both John and Chris's favorite band. And Chris decides to continue on with the celebration later that night, inviting Adebayo into his trailer as she drops him off at home so the two can share a beer. But despite appearing to genuinely enjoy hanging out with him, Adebayo, when the opportunity presents itself, still decides to see out her mother's request and plants the diary in his home, which she feels pretty bad about and leaves her unable to sleep. So she heads back over to the team's headquarters, where Myrn's scene's still working as well. There, she comes across Chris's X-ray helmet and decides to try it out for herself. But, to her shock, when she looks through it at Myrn, she learns that he's actually a butterfly, prompting her to make a run for it, but he quickly manages to tackle her to the ground, and explains that he isn't looking to harm her before the two are then joined by Harcourt, who reveals she's known that Myrn was a butterfly since the Goff mission, and has chosen to continue following his orders since he's already helped them out too much to be plotting against them. Shifting focus back to Augie once again now, as he reveals to the lead detectives on the case, Detective Sophie Song and Detective Larry Fitzgibbon, that Peacemaker was the one actually behind Annie Stirphousen's murder, not him, and demands they take his fingerprints to see if they really match the ones at the scene. So they do just that, and see that he's actually telling the truth. But, despite having compared the prints themselves, they're informed that Augie still won't be getting released by their newly appointed captain, Casper Locke, who, in reality, is a mercenary and acquaintance of Myrn who'd been hired by Amanda Waller to pose as the police captain. Song refuses to stand by Locke's decision though, and instead goes over his head to get a warrant for Chris's arrest, which she's granted after showing all the evidence against him to a judge. And so, since Chris is now the wanted suspect for Annie's murder, Song and Fitzgibbon are forced to let Augie walk free, who, upon getting out, sets out to finally kill his son once and for all. Song, meanwhile, leads a team to Chris's trailer, where he's currently spending the morning with Eagly, Vigilante, and Goff. And luckily, he's warned by Myrn about the cops' arrival just moments before they barge into the home, allowing them to narrowly escape through the roof. Song, though, soon notices Eagly flying towards the woods, and so heads back there as well, soon to be met by Vigilante inadvertently falling out of a tree, which also results in them dropping the container holding Goff, allowing the creature to fly straight into Song's mouth and overtake her body, leaving the two and Eagly no choice but to run off and head back to their headquarters, where Chris finally reveals that he kept Goff all this time and how the creature's now taken over a cop. Although this is very bad, the team also learns of some good news, as Economos had managed to track down where the butterflies are getting their amber fluid, revealed to be milked from some sort of creature within the caverns on Coverdale Ranch, so they prepare to begin their journey to the ranch the following day. Back at the police station, the detective's Song situation quickly becomes even worse, as that night, Song enters the station alongside an army of butterflies to take over the entire police force, as well as several inmates. And for their first order of business, the now butterfly-controlled Locke holds a press conference to reveal Peacemaker's diary, found during the seizure of his home, to the public, which implicates he was responsible for the murders of Annie Stirphousen, Royland Goff and his family, and all of those killed at the Gland Thai bottling plant. Shortly after this press conference hits the news, Harcourt confronts Adebayo, correctly assuming she'd planted the diary per Waller's orders. And so, Leota comes clean about everything, for the two are then joined by Myrn, urging them to leave ASAP before Locke and the other butterflies show up. Unfortunately though, they arrive just before Myrn can join them in their escape. So he stays behind to gun down as many of them as he can, before ultimately having both his human and butterfly forms killed by Song. Peacemaker, meanwhile, upon learning of the diary and Adebayo's betrayal, decides to just head out along with Vigilante to kill the cow and finally put an end to this mission. And the two are also soon joined by Economos. But the three's trip is quickly interrupted by the sudden arrival of the White Dragon and the Aryan Empire, with the dragon flying straight into their vehicle to send them off the road, before his minions then unleash a relentless beatdown against the heroes as Augie prepares to finally kill his son. But just before he can finish the job, Vigilante manages to shut down his suit's abilities by attacking the gaps in his armor, while Economos gets hold of a gun and shoots down each of his followers, enabling Chris to gain control of the fight and repeatedly punch his father in the face while blaming him for what happened to his brother and for the person he's turned into, before then grabbing a gun himself and aiming it at Augie's head, who still continues to berate his son, claiming he's too weak to pull the trigger. But Chris ultimately does just that. The three then call and meet back up with Harcourt and Adebayo, realizing they're going to need all hands on deck to kill the cow, even with all the tension between them. But still, they worry that the five of them, in the end, just might not be enough. So Adebayo calls up her mother and requests she contact the Justice League. They can't sit around awaiting their arrival though, since Myrn had previously informed them that the Butterfly's next move will likely be to transport their cow to another location using a teleportation device. So they form a plan to plant Peacemaker's sonic boom helmet with a walkie taped inside within the barn, with Chris killing a nearby Butterfly standing guard and Economos changing into the Butterfly's police attire to sneak inside and plant the helmet. But almost immediately after John exits the barn, the helmet's noticed by one of the Butterflies, leading them to chase after him and forcing Adebayo to activate Sonic Boom early, killing a bunch of butterflies in the process, but not the cow. So once the helmet's charges run out, the team enters the ranch as well, and impressively guns down the remaining butterflies as Chris follows Song down towards the cow. Although, unfortunately, during the shootout, Harcourt is severely wounded. Still, she urges Adebayo to go help Peacemaker, and so she follows him into the barn while wearing his human torpedo helmet, which she attempts to use to aid him in his fight with Song, but she completely misses and knocks herself out instead. Song doesn't take this opportunity to kill Chris though, and instead stops their fighting in hopes that he'll help them in transporting the cow, explaining that the butterflies originally came to Earth only because they needed a new home due to their own planet becoming unlivable. But not long after they arrived, they realized that Earth and its people were on the exact same trajectory as their home planet. So they made a vow to do whatever they could to change their future and save this world, no matter how many lives it costs, an ideology she feels Peacemaker can relate to. So she proposes he join them in saving his world and keeping the peace. But despite understanding their point of view, Chris ultimately decides against helping them, instead activating Human Torpedo to send Adebayo straight through the cow, before shooting Song in the chest. With the cow and the butterflies all presumably dead, Chris carries Harcourt off the ranch with the team beside him, just as the Justice League manages to finally show up. Fortunately, Harcourt's able to survive the battle, although she's left in a coma for a few days, so Chris just stays by her side until she wakes up. While Adebayo, looking to make things right with Chris, soon holds a public press conference to explain that Peacemaker wasn't actually the villain he was made out to be, and expose Amanda Waller's Task Force X operation. Throughout all this commotion, the team hadn't even realized until it was too late that Judo Master had escaped. But luckily, he only ends up making it to Coverdale Ranch the morning following the massacre, with him finding all the butterflies dead, outside of the Goff Song butterfly, who it turns out Peacemaker's decided to continue taking care of. Now, for the first time in over 4,000 years, let's revisit the nation of Kahndaq, which we learn since Teth Adams' imprisonment has been oppressed by one invader after another, and is now, unfortunately, occupied by international mercenaries known as the Intergang. In addition, we also learn that the Kahndaqi people don't have a complete understanding of their former champion's history, with them unaware of the destruction Teth Adam had caused and only knowing him to be a hero. We then meet archaeologist Adriana Tomaz, her brother Kareem, and their colleagues Samir and Ishmael, as they, desperate for a way to stop the Intergang, search for the crown of Sabak. And they eventually locate it within a cave that they soon realize is also the tomb where Teth Adam had been imprisoned. Upon gaining possession of the crown though, they're promptly ambushed by the Intergang, who end up killing Samir and prepare to do the same to the others. So Adriana, seeing no other way out, reads off an incantation carved into the ground to resurrect Teth Adam, who who immediately attacks and kills nearly all of the surrounding threats, which in turn allows Adriana and Kareem to escape with the crown, unfortunately without Ishmael, who's seemingly killed by falling debris. Their escape's interrupted though, as Adam's fight journeys outside along with them, which sees him demolish multiple intergang aircrafts and kill even more of their soldiers until the final mercenary left standing fires a rocket made of Eternium at him, which, to his surprise, actually wounds him, and after killing the final mercenary, he loses consciousness and crashes to the ground. So, Adriana and Kareem decide to bring Adam back home with them, where, upon awakening, he's met by Adriana's son, Amon, a huge believer in Teth Adam as Kahndaq's champion, and who asks that he helps set them free. But Adam declines, claiming he's not a hero. Before Amon can attempt to convince him any further, Adam's suddenly met by the Justice Society, made up of heroes such as the Hawkman Carter Hall, a mystical sorcerer named Kent Nelson, and also known as Dr. Fate, the Cyclone Maxine Hunkel, who has the ability to control the wind, and Al Rothstein, aka Atom Smasher, who's capable of increasing his size to become a giant. It turns out that the Justice Society had actually been informed of Teth Adam's return by Amanda Waller, who's employed them to take the champion into custody, believing he's too dangerous to live amongst humans on Earth. And so they've now come to do just that, at first attempting to bring him in peacefully, but they're quickly forced into a battle against, and ultimately fail to subdue him, as he instead manages to flee to the ruins of Akhdon's palace. So the Justice Society then turn their attention to Amon and Adriana, who Dr. Fate's able to sense are in possession of the Crown of Sabak. But before he can convince them to hand it over, Amon manages to sneak back home to hide it. There, he's also met by a somehow still alive Ishmael, who suddenly holds the boy at gunpoint and reveals himself to actually be a leader of Intergang. But before he can harm Amon or take the crown, he's fought off by Kareem, allowing Amon a moment to escape the room and inform his mother over the phone of Ishmael's betrayal, before Kareem's then shot in the stomach and Amon's taken to a mine used by the Intergang for the extraction of Eternium. Upon learning of Amon's capture, the Justice Society are convinced by Adriana to track down and fight alongside Teth Adam to save him and bring an end to the Intergang once and for all. Although, before doing that, they quickly stop by her home to pick up the Crown of Sabak hidden by Amon, as well as patch up Kareem. Once collecting the crown, the group flies over to the mine to meet with Ishmael, who offers only to give them Amon if they hand over the crown. So, although the Justice Society are against the agreement, Adriana ultimately decides to give it to him, and Ishmael, now finally wielding the Crown of Sabak, takes this opportunity to reveal that he's actually the last living descendant of King Akhdon, before then going to kill Amon anyway. But the gunshot is, fortunately, stopped by Adam, who then creates a huge blast to kill Ishmael. The blast also completely destroys the mine and severely injures Amon, leading a guilt-ridden Adam to fly off once again to the ruins of the palace, although this time he's followed by Carter, to whom he confesses the truth of his origins that saw similar events to what just took place with Amon. And Adam, not wanting to cause any more destruction and believing himself unworthy of the powers he was given, also decides to relinquish his powers and allows himself to be taken to Amanda Waller's underwater prison by the Justice Society. Following Adam's imprisonment, though, the team is alerted of a threat suddenly emerging from below that's revealed to be the demon Sabak, reborn thanks to Ishmael, who, following his death, was sent to the Rock of Finality, an extra-dimensional realm where evil souls are sent and subjected to punitive suffering, and there he was made the demon's champion. So the team prepares to battle the demon, but upon their arrival at the palace, Dr. Fate creates a magical force field to keep the rest of the team from entering, revealing he'd had a vision that Hawkman would die in the battle if he didn't sacrifice his own life. And so he says goodbye to his friend and battles Sabak alone, during which he also communicates with a still imprisoned Teth Adam so that he can break free of his restraints and join the fight alongside the team, before Fate is then ultimately killed. The rest of the Justice Society then enters their own battle with Sabak, in which they're soon aided by Teth Adam, whose power proves to be too much for the demon, who's eventually torn in half by the champion. Following the battle, the Justice Society decides against taking Adam back to prison, opting to instead have him continue on as Kahndaq's protector, and he decides going forward to take on the name of Black Adam. He's later contacted, though, by Amanda Waller via drone, who warns him that if he ever steps foot outside of Kahndaq, he'll not live to regret it, claiming she can call in a favor from people not of this planet. But in response, he just urges her to send them all, leading shortly thereafter to the sudden arrival of Superman, hoping they could talk. Jumping from Kahndaq over to Athens, Greece now, and to the Acropolis Museum, where we see the staff crafted from the Tree of Life and previously broken in two by Billy Batson is now being kept. Or that is until the arrival of two mysterious women revealed to be the daughters of the Titan Atlas, Hespera and Calypso, who wreak havoc on the museum en route to stealing the staff. Upon retrieving it, they bring the staff back with them to the God Realm and before the wizard Shazam, who's been imprisoned here since granting Billy his powers, and he's rightfully infuriated that Billy had stupidly broken the staff in half. But there's not much he can do about that now, as the Daughters of Atlas force him to repair it using their powers of elements and chaos. As they take the staff from his hands though, he manages to tear off a small splinter that allows him to later communicate with Billy for the first time in years through his dreams, which sees himself out on a date with Wonder Woman. And the wizard immediately berates Billy for using his powers foolishly and destroying the barrier between their two realms, as he's now brought forth the return of the Daughters of Atlas, who he warns will be coming for him and his family. So Billy calls a meeting the following day with the rest of the Shazamily, who, over the last few years, have drifted apart a bit due to them growing older and finding their own interests, with Freddy in particular becoming the most distant, especially since recently meeting and taking a liking to the new girl at school, Anne, who he decides to hang out with instead of attending the family meeting. Still, the rest of the family continues looking into the Daughters of Atlas without him, and thanks to a sentient pen Pedro had found within the Rock of Eternity named Steve, they learn all about the staff, Atlas, and his daughter's history, as well as that Atlas also had a third daughter named Anthea, who wields the power of Axis or matter manipulation. Freddy, meanwhile, still trying to win Anne over, attempts to prove how cool he is by introducing her to one of his superhero best friends, which is really just himself. But this turns out to have been a mistake, as the two are then joined by Anne's sisters, Hespera and Calypso, who promptly blast Freddy with the staff to rid him of his powers. Before they can inflict any further damage onto him though, the rest of the Shazamily make their arrival, as Billy had managed to put together that Anne could possibly be Anthea. But they're unable to actually save him, as the sisters manage to escape with him back to the God Realm, while Hespera also places an indestructible dome around the city, trapping everyone inside. Upon returning to the God Realm, Calypso attempts to use her powers of chaos to scramble Freddy's mind and force him to tell them the champions' names. But he proves to be stronger than he appears, managing to hold her powers off long enough for a letter to arrive from the Shazamily, who in it propose a trade, claiming they'll give up their powers if they return Freddy unharmed. The sisters don't plan on making any sort of deal though, and instead, now that the heroes have come out of hiding, head back down to Earth to take their powers themselves. Although before that, they also throw Freddy, along with the wizard, since they no longer have any use for either of them, into the pit to be killed by Ladin the Dragon, guardian of the Garden of Atlas. But the two's death at the hands of the dragon is ultimately prevented thanks to Anne, who really does like Freddy and doesn't want to see him get hurt, and so she apologizes for deceiving him and shows him a path for them to escape. Meanwhile, the Shazamily soon met and attacked by the sisters, with Calypso immediately using the staff to rid Pedro of his powers, but she's fortunately soon taken out of the fight by a blast from Eugene, while the rest of the heroes work together to incapacitate Hespera as well, who they then take back with them and imprison within the Rock of Eternity. It turns out, though, that Hespera had actually intended to be captured, as she quickly manages to escape her cell while the team's discussing their next move, and retrieves from within the cave a black apple, which is soon revealed to be the reason behind the sisters' return to Earth in the first place, the golden apple from the Tree of Life, capable of restoring their realm, which she then takes back with her to the God Realm, unfortunately returning just as the wizard and Freddy were able to escape. Upon seeing they're now in possession of the apple though, the wizard decides against leaving, and instead follows Hespera as she hands it over to her sisters, who have differing opinions on what to do next with the seed, as while Hespera and Anthea only want to use it to restore their realm, Calypso believes they should get revenge against the humans and plant it in their world so that it can be overrun by monsters. But before they can come to a decision, they notice Freddy attempting to steal the apple, so they prepare to kill him with the staff, but their attempt is thwarted by the sudden arrival of Billy, who'd followed Hespera back to the God Realm, and who causes enough of a distraction to allow Freddy to regain his powers from the staff, before the two and the wizard then escape back to their cave with the golden apple. They don't have much time to celebrate this victory though, as Calypso immediately unleashes Ladin the Dragon onto the heroes, forcing them out of their cave and up into their home so they can warn Victor and Rosa of and protect them from the coming conflict. which also forces them to reveal their superhero identities to their foster parents. But unfortunately, as the heroes try flying them off to safety, Calypso manages to blast each of them, outside of Billy, with the staff, ridding them of their superpowers and allowing her to regain possession of the apple, which she then plants into the ground, unleashing various monsters onto Earth, much to her sister's dismay. And Aspera attempts to stop this before any further damage can be done, but she's instead suddenly stabbed through the back by Layden, per Calypso's command, who then also blasts Anne with the staff as she attempts to escape, ridding her of her powers. So, with her sisters and the rest of the Shazamily out of the equation, Billy's the only one left to take Calypso on, who immediately aims the staff at him as well, but he's able to counter its blast with a blast of his own, although in the process, he inadvertently allows the staff to absorb some of his power. So he then flies off to the severely wounded but still alive Aspera, as he's formed a plan to overload the staff with power until it explodes and kills Layden and Calypso. But in order to do this without anyone else getting hurt, he needs Aspera to make the dome smaller and to trap only himself, Calypso, and Layden inside. And so she does after Billy manages to lure her sister back to where she planted the Tree of Life. And after Billy says a heartfelt farewell to his family, he engages in a battle with her and the Beast, all while overloading the staff with enough power to create a huge explosion that kills them and himself, as well as destroys the Tree of Life and all the monsters it brought to Earth. Heartbroken by Billy's loss, his family, Anne, and the wizard bring him to the God Realm for his burial. But he isn't actually gone for long, as suddenly Wonder Woman arrives, having heard of Billy's sacrifice, and uses her own God-given powers to restore the staff's powers, to in turn revive the God's Realm and bring Billy back to life, who thanks her for her help and also asks her out on a date, but she declines. So he turns his attention back to his family, all of whom's powers he restores with the staff. Along with his Shazam family, Billy's later presented with an opportunity to join another superhero team when he's met by Amelia Harcourt and John Economos, sent by Amanda Waller to recruit Shazam into the Justice Society. But he ends up declining, as he'd rather be in the Justice League with Wonder Woman. Speaking of Wonder Woman and the Justice League, she, Batman, and the Flash are next seen joining forces to deal with a robbery gone wrong at Gotham General Hospital by the son of Gotham crime boss Carmine Falcone, Alberto, and his crew, who'd broken into the lab and stolen a highly deadly virus just before Batman arrived to intercept them, resulting in them then blasting their way out of the building, causing it to now begin collapsing. So, Batman sends Flash over to the hospital to save the civilians trapped inside, while he and Wonder Woman track down and apprehend Falcone. Once having handled that, they all, once again, go their separate ways, with Barry heading off to work, after which he's met by a former classmate of his and his crush growing up, Iris West. It just so happens that Iris is now a reporter and is covering Barry's father's appeal taking place the following day. So she asks Barry if he'd like to comment on it, but all he has to say is that his father's innocent. It doesn't appear that Barry is going to be able to prove that though, since the only evidence that could have exonerated him is footage from the grocery store the day of his mother's murder, which, although having been enhanced to a higher definition with help from Bruce, still doesn't showcase anything that proves his innocence, since Henry's face still can't be seen at any point. So Barry calls up his father to inform him of the unfortunate news, and with them having tried everything they could, Henry tells Barry not to worry about him anymore, and to just focus on enjoying his own life before the call is abruptly disconnected. Following their call, Barry decides to go out on a run to blow off some steam, but his frustration results in him running faster than he ever has before until he suddenly finds himself entering the Speed Force, a layer of dimensional reality that manipulates space-time, and through which he realizes he's capable of traveling through time. So, upon returning to the present, he immediately meets with and informs Bruce of his discovery, which Bruce promptly warns against experimenting with any further, as they have no idea what the consequences of even the slightest change could be. But Barry believes this could be his chance to fix things and save his parents, or even Bruce's parents. Although, Bruce doesn't really consider this a possibility, and just says for Barry to stop letting his tragedy define who he is. Barry, though, can't shake the desire to change things, and so forms a plan to save his parents without even having to interact with them, traveling back to 2004 and ensuring that his mom doesn't forget to pick up a can of tomatoes from the store. And this immediately appears to have worked, as, during his journey back to the present, new memories of him and his parents begin to appear within the Speed Force's Chrono Bowl, until his journey is then suddenly interrupted by an unknown being appearing in the Chrono Bowl as well, rushing straight towards and knocking him out of the Speed Force back to 2013. He doesn't immediately realize he'd landed in the wrong time though, and so he heads back home to reunite with his parents, sharing their first meal together since he was a little boy. Although this is quickly interrupted upon him noticing his younger, 18-year-old self approaching the house, so he rushes outside and tackles him before his parents notice. Having realized what's happened, Barry quickly explains to 2013 Barry how he's here and just asks that he not allow their interaction to change anything about his future before preparing to leave. But just then, he notices a thunderstorm outside and realizes that today's the day he gets his powers at the Central City Crime Lab. So, to ensure he still gets them and has a way to get back to his time, he takes 2013 Barry with him to the lab and places him exactly where he was sitting when he got struck by lightning. But 2013 Barry doesn't like the prospect of getting electrocuted, and so attempts to leave, leading to a back and forth between the two until they both end up being struck by the lightning bolt, granting 2013 Barry superhuman speed, while also unfortunately taking present Barry's powers away. Now unable to get himself home, Barry spends the following morning teaching his variant how to control his abilities so that he can, eventually, recreate the Chrono Bowl to give him access to the Speed Force. But this plan's also soon interrupted when present Barry overhears a news broadcast covering the arrival of an unknown spaceship that he knows to be General Zod's Black Zero starship, revealing that today's also the day that Zod first arrives on Earth. Barry's still pretty guilt-ridden from his failure to offer any real help during Zod's attack in his time, and so he decides to put his original plan on hold, opting to instead try and track down the rest of the Justice League so they could potentially stop Zod before any destruction can be done. The only member he's actually able to locate though is Bruce Wayne, so the two make their way over to Wayne Manor, where, upon entering, they're promptly attacked by Bruce. Although not the one we know, as this Bruce appears much older and is now retired from being Batman. Once they manage to calm Bruce down, Barry explains everything that's happened and why he's here, as well as his confusion surrounding Bruce being so much older and looking so different than how he remembers him in 2013. And Bruce explains that when you go back in time to change the past, it doesn't actually just change your future, but rather creates an entirely new branch in time with a different past and future. Barry also explains to Bruce how their Zod problem played out in his time, with him being eventually defeated by Superman in an incredibly destructive battle, and proposes that Bruce help them track Superman down, to which he initially declines, feeling his crime-fighting days are long behind him. But, after some time to think about it, he decides to suit up for the first time in years and join them in their quest. It doesn't take long for Bruce to pinpoint Superman's possible location, which appears to be a Siberian black site where he's currently being held by a group of mercenaries. So they make their way over in the Batwing, and once there, Batman almost immediately single-handedly takes out every mercenary in their path, en route to finding where they believe Superman is being held. But, upon unlocking the cell, it's revealed to only be holding an unknown but very sick woman. Not wanting to leave her like this, Barry decides to carry her out of the building with them as they attempt to make their escape, during which they're met and eventually surrounded by even more mercenaries. But they all end up being swiftly taken out by the sickly woman, who's revealed to actually be a Kryptonian named Kara Zor-El, once her strength is restored upon being exposed to the sun. The four then return to Wayne Manor, and there, Barry asks if she knows of Kal-El, leading her to reveal that she's actually his cousin, sent to Earth alongside him ahead of Krypton's destruction, but she's unfortunately yet to find him since then. Despite tracking down both Batman and Supergirl though, Barry feels that if they're really going to stand a chance against Zod, he'll need his powers as well. So he and Bruce put together an experiment to potentially give him back his powers using the same chemicals from the night he first got them, in a sudden electrical shock. But it unfortunately fails, and instead leaves Barry severely injured, prompting Kara to perform an experiment of her own, flying Barry up into the sky in the midst of a huge thunderstorm and allowing him to be struck by an actual bolt of lightning, which ends up working and once again grants him the powers of the Flash. So, with his powers restored, the four suit up to take on Zod, who we see has already unleashed the World Engine and begun his attack on Earth after they'd failed to make good on his demands and bring him the Kryptonian living among them. Upon entering the battlefield, Supergirl immediately rushes towards Zod as the two Flashes and Batman take on the rest of his army. And during their initial encounter, Zod reveals how he's been looking forward to finally meeting her, since it turns out he'd actually already located Kal-El shortly following the destruction of Krypton, and aware Jor-El had combined the growth codex with the DNA of a Kryptonian child, had attempted to extract the codex from the infant, although that inevitably failed since it wasn't Kal-El's DNA the codex was hidden within, but rather Kara's. So he believes she must be sacrificed for Krypton to live again, just as Kal-El was. This revelation prompts an immediate and relentless attack from Kara onto Zod that appears to leave him weak enough for her to take hold of the device controlling the world engine and shut it down. But it turns out he was just playing possum, as she's suddenly stabbed through the back by Zod, who then extracts the codex from her DNA, a process that kills her. The rest of the battle, unfortunately, isn't going very well either, as Batman struggles to handle so many Kryptonians at once, and eventually has his Batwing irreversibly damaged. So, with no way to avoid crashing, he decides to aim his aircraft straight into a Kryptonian ship, resulting in a huge explosion that the two Barrys are left to watch from afar. With just the two Flashes left, 2013 Barry suggests they go back in time a bit, just before Kara and Bruce were killed, and despite 2022 Barry feeling that might not be the best idea, they go ahead with it anyway. But, although delaying their deaths for just a few moments longer, both heroes still end up being killed once again, before the two Flashes are then forced to take on the Sword of Ra's strongest soldier, Namek, who, although proving to be a worthy adversary, is ultimately killed by a huge blast unleashed by the duo that also destroys his armor, with one shard landing in 2013 Flash's forearm. Immediately following his death, the two are then also attacked by Farah Ul, Zod's sub-commander, although 2013 Barry manages to make shockingly quick work of her, using the shard from Namek's armor to easily kill her, before once again running off to try and save Batman and Supergirl, despite 2022 Barry already having come to the realization that maybe Kara and Bruce's deaths just can't be prevented. Although trying over and over and over again, no matter what he does, every one of 2013 Barry's attempts to save them fail, proving these events really are an inevitable intersection. And so, 2022 Barry is forced to accept that there's just no world where he can save his mother, and decides it's time he returned to 2004 to set things back on their original path. But 2013 Barry still refuses to accept any of this, and instead re-enters the battle against Zod once again, which 2022 Barry tries to prevent until he's suddenly stopped from doing so by the unknown being who'd knocked him out of the Chrono Bowl earlier, who, following 2013 Barry's return, is now revealed to actually be a much older 2013 Barry, still yet to figure out how to save his world. He explains that the reason he'd pushed Barry out of the Speed Force originally was so that he would set him on this path. But since then, no matter what he tries to do, there's always Barry standing in his way. Although for good reason, since Dark Flash's endless attempts to save his world have also begun destroying the fabric of others, with various Chrono Bowls now beginning to crash into theirs, and so 2022 Barry tries convincing him to stop before everything gets destroyed. But Dark Flash refuses and instead looks to kill Barry. However, his fatal attack is thwarted by 2013 Barry, who uses his own body to shield his future self, and ultimately, this stab through the back results in his death, which in turn erases Dark Flash from existence. So, with his variants now dead and the multiverse slowly returning back to normal, Barry once again travels back in time to 2004 and to the exact moment he placed the can of tomatoes in his mom's shopping cart, from which he now retrieves them, although only after taking a moment to appreciate her presence and puts them back on the shelf. Once in the aisle though, he realizes that if he places all the crushed tomatoes on the top shelf rather than leaving them towards the bottom, then when his father later heads to the store, he'd have to look up to grab them, and maybe then his face would be visible in the security footage. So he does just that before finally returning to the present, which appears to be no different than how he left it, and heading off to court in the morning for his father's hearing, during which, thanks to the slight change he'd made to the tomatoes, Henry's finally proven innocent, with his face now clearly visible in the security footage. Following the hearing, things continue to get even better for Barry, when Iris West suggests the two go out to dinner together. But his happiness soon turns to confusion when Bruce Wayne arrives at the courthouse to congratulate him, and is revealed to no longer look anything like how he'd left him. Sometime following this, Barry also reunites with Arthur Curry, who fortunately still looks exactly the same as before, and after a night of drinking, Barry tries to talk through his confusion about all that's happened with him, but Arthur's way too drunk to understand anything, and just ends up falling asleep in a puddle. A lot's changed in Arthur's life since the last time we saw him 4 years ago, with him and Mara having recently gotten married and subsequently having a son named Arthur Jr., who we see has inherited his father's ability to communicate with sea creatures. But not all has been well as of late, as Atlantis has been suffering a series of plagues resulting from rising sea temperatures, which the Council of Atlantis believes is due to global warming on the surface, causing their desire to launch an attack against the humans to grow greater and greater. And among the lives taken by the recent plagues is that of Noetus Volko. But despite losing his beloved mentor, Arthur still doesn't believe a war will solve anything, and suggests to the council that it may just be time for Atlantis to reveal itself to the rest of the world. An idea they strongly vote against, not seeking to coexist with the humans. It turns out, though, that the heating of the planet hasn't actually been the humans' doing, but rather the Black Manta David Kane's, who himself had spent the last 4 years searching for Atlantis and Atlantean technology with help from Dr. Stephen Shin so that he could fix his power suit damaged during his and Aquaman's battle and finally avenge his father by killing Arthur. But during his search for the kingdom, he encountered a mysterious cave in Antarctica, inside of which he stumbled upon a trident broken in two that soon revealed to be the Black Trident previously wielded by King Kordax of the Lost Kingdom of Nekris, which Manta promptly reassembles, allowing Kordax to telepathically communicate with him, offering to grant Manta the strength to kill Aquaman in exchange for freeing him from his frozen prison, and Manta agrees. To do this, Kordax first sends Manta to retrieve the highly volatile orichalcum from Atlantis' various secret storage vaults, and the use of it begins negatively impacting the planet's climate, causing multiple natural disasters on land in addition to the aforementioned plagues beneath it. But eventually, the Atlanteans do finally become aware of Manta's recent heists when he attempts a final one within Atlantis itself. Unfortunately though, at the time of Manta's invasion, Arthur's not actually there to offer any resistance, since he still chooses to spend half his time on the surface with his father, and so Atlana and Mara are left leading the charge against him, which doesn't go particularly well for either of them, as Atlana's quickly incapacitated while Mara's sent flying and severely wounded by a blast from Manta's helmet, just moments before Aquaman finally arrives and forces him to escape. Furious that his wife was almost killed, and now having realized that Manta was behind all the recent deaths in the kingdom, Arthur prepares to track him down, although, in order to do this, he'll need some help from his brother Orm, since he'd worked with Manta in the past. So, after being fitted with a suit capable of turning him invisible by King Nereus, Arthur, along with a tactical operations and pursuit operative, or Topo for short, called a cephalopod, travels over to the Deserter Kingdom, where Orm's currently being held, and promptly takes out a group of Deserter remnants, death-worshipping ascetics who survived when the Sahara went dry by turning to blood for sustenance, en route to breaking his brother out. Orm's quite frustrated that Arthur had released him from his imprisonment, feeling it was his honor to Atlantis to see out his sentence. So he claims that, once they've dealt with David Kane, he'll be turning himself back in. To begin their search for Kane, Orm leads them to the Sunken Citadel, described as the one place in the world where the scum of the land and sea mingle, and brings Arthur before its leader, King Fish, who they attempt to speak with peacefully at first, but they're ultimately required to use force to get the information they want, with King Fish revealing that Manta's currently hiding in a dormant volcano called Devil's Deep. So the two brothers swim their way over, and after sending Topo back to Atlantis to give them their coordinates, they enter Kane's hideout and take out every guard in their path as they make their way into the control room, where they encounter Dr. Shin, who immediately surrenders, explaining that, although he had agreed to work with Kane originally, it was only because he wanted to see Atlantis with his own two eyes and share its wonders with the world. But he's now realized Manta has much more evil intentions, which he attempts to reveal to them but is interrupted by a sudden explosion that sends them flying. Arthur and Orm are then forced to fight off even more of Manta's guards before finally encountering Manta himself, who maintains the upper hand early on in their brawl, despite the numbers disadvantage, with him nearly sending the Black Trident straight into Orm, but the latter manages to dodge and takes hold of the trident for himself, bringing on a sudden vision of all of the Lost Kingdom's history, and leaving him vulnerable to a blast from Manta, who then chooses to retreat once again as Arthur fails to chase him down. With them having failed to capture Manta yet again, the two regroup with Atlana, Mara, Nereus, and the Brine King, ruler of the Brine Kingdom, to all of whom Orm reveals Nekris' hidden history, including the blood magic King Atlan used to imprison Kordax and his army, which leads Queen Atlana to reveal that, in order to break a spell cast with blood magic, you need the blood of whomever casted it or the blood of their descendants, and Arthur realizes that, since Manta was unable to take blood from him, Orm, or Atlana, he must be going after Arthur Jr. next. So the heroes rush back to Arthur's father's home in hopes of intercepting him, but ultimately arrive too late, as Arthur Jr. has already been kidnapped, while Arthur's father Tom is found severely wounded. Fortunately though, Atlantean doctors arrive soon enough to ensure his survival, so Arthur is once again able to turn his focus back to Manta, whose location they soon discover thanks to Dr. Shin sending out a signal from within his ship. Upon arriving at said location, revealed to be the Lost Kingdom of Nekris itself, Atlantis' army is almost immediately attacked by Kordax's army of monsters, so while the rest of Atlantis stays back to fight them off, Arthur tracks down Manta, with whom he engages in a back-and-forth battle that it appears for a moment Manta may come out on top of, But luckily for Arthur, he's saved in the nick of time by Mara, who sends Kane flying with a water blast before finding and embracing Arthur Jr., who she then attempts to run off with, prompting Manta to launch his black trident at her. But this attack is also thwarted, this time by Orm, who snatches the trident out of the air. Along with being in possession of the trident though, comes being possessed by Kordax, whose strength is now transferred from Manta to Orm, allowing Arthur to easily knock the former out before being struck in the face twice by the latter, resulting in blood dripping from his mouth that allows Kordax to finally be released. So Arthur attempts to snatch the trident out of Orm's hands, nearly allowing Kordax to corrupt both of them. But eventually, Arthur is able to break both himself and Orm out of it with a touching heart-to-heart that convinces Orm to turn over the trident, which Arthur then launches at the now freed Kordax, but the former king manages to easily catch it. So Arthur launches his own trident at him immediately after, which sails straight through the black trident and into Kordax, resulting in his death and a huge explosion that causes the Lost Kingdom to begin crumbling, with Black Manta nearly falling into the abyss below. So Arthur, looking to right the wrong he made the day he let Kane's father die, attempts to save him, but Manta refuses to accept his help and instead allows himself to fall to his presumed death. The Atlanteans, though, manage to make it out the crumbling kingdom unscathed, and once back on the surface, Arthur offers Orm a chance to walk free, believing his debt to the kingdom has been paid, which Orm accepts, swimming off to begin a new life on his own. Sometime following this, Arthur also decides to see out his own suggestion from earlier, and holds a press conference in front of the United Nations to reveal Atlantis to the surface. Jumping ahead a year now, into 2023, as we're taken over to Palmera City in Texas to meet Gotham Law University graduate Jaime Reyes, as he returns to his hometown and reunites with his family, made up of his mom Rocio, his dad Alberto, his grandma Nana, his sister Milagro, and his uncle Rudy, who take him to his favorite taco spot for lunch. Unfortunately though, the celebration of Jaime's homecoming is quickly followed by some bad news, as while he was gone, his family struggled greatly to stay afloat, primarily as a result of Alberto suffering a heart attack, which then played a big part in them losing their family-owned auto shop, and now they're on the verge of losing their family home. This news completely shocks Jaime, but he's not too worried about what the future holds for them, believing that now that he has his degree, he'll be able to find a job to help them out of debt in no time. This isn't how things end up playing out though, as the only job available to him for now is as a janitor alongside his sister at Cord Industries, where we finally meet back up with Victoria Cord following the end of her 15-year search for the Scarab, which she believes she can use the abilities of to enhance her own project of weaponized armors, the One-Man Army Corps, aka the OMAC. Her now adult niece Jennifer isn't a fan of the project though, especially since it had already been shut down in the past. But Victoria has no care for her opinion and warns her to stay out of her way. These threats towards Jenny also happen to be overheard by Jaime, and as Carapax prepares to forcefully remove her from the building, he decides to step in, asking they leave her alone, before they're then also joined by Milagro, who just finished taking a dump in one of Cord's first-class bathrooms, which promptly results in them both being fired. Jenny, though, appreciative of him coming to her defense, tells Jaime to come by Cord Tower the following day, believing she may be able to get him a job somewhere else within the company. And so he does just that, but he isn't immediately able to find her there, as Jenny's currently in the midst of sneaking into the building's laboratory in search of the Scarab, which she quickly comes across and throws into a big belly burger box, although her exit's soon interrupted when she's eventually tracked down by Jaime, who she just tries to ignore, but his pursuit slows her down long enough for the Scarab's disappearance to be noticed by Dr. Jose Morales, who orders the building to be locked down. So, now unable to escape herself, Jenny hands the Big Belly Burger box to Jaime and begs him to guard it with his life, and he agrees. So he takes the box back home with him, where, despite Jenny ordering him not to, he's eventually convinced by the rest of his family to open it up, revealing the Scarab inside, which, upon Jaime making contact with it, suddenly activates and fuses itself to his body, transforming him into a living weapon and completely covering his body in armor, before then beginning a systems check, which activates the suit's thrusters and propels Jaime into the sky and eventually into space, before he's then sent crashing back through the ceiling of his home and reverted back to his human form. Frightened by all of what just happened, Jaime rushes off to Cord Tower in his uncle's truck to find Jenny, and he surprisingly runs into her rather quickly, although she appears to be hiding from someone, who's soon revealed upon her entering the truck to be multiple Cord soldiers as they open fire at them, forcing him to speed off and return home with her. There, she explains to Jaime and his family what the Scarab is, revealing it to be a world-destroying weapon given to her father when she was young, and she apologizes for it now having chosen Jaime, which she didn't think was a possibility when she initially gave it to him. To further answer any questions he may have, Jenny next takes him along with his uncle Rudy, since he refuses to let Jaime take his trunk alone again after the damage it just endured, to her childhood home, inside of which is her father's hidden laboratory, where he'd created all of his Blue Beetle equipment and studied the scarab. This data, though, is encrypted, so Rudy begins an attempt to crack into Ted's computer, and as he does that, Jenny opens up about her childhood to Jaime, which was pretty lonely after her mom died, made even worse by her father, obsessed with the scarab, disappearing for weeks at a time before just disappearing completely. But Jaime manages to cheer her up a bit, and she thanks him for giving her someone to talk to. Rudy then calls the two back down to her father's lab, and reveals some of what we already know, specifically that there's no way for them to separate the scarab from Jaime's body without him being dead first, which is pretty frustrating for him to hear, but Rudy sees his new abilities as a gift sent from the universe, and believes they must have been given to him for a reason. The three then notice a Cord helicopter flying overhead, and realize it's heading straight in the direction of the Reyes family home. So Jaime attempts to summon the suit, but he hasn't yet formed enough of a connection with Khaji-Da to naturally call for them to come out. So he instead just leaps off the roof, expecting the suit to protect him, which it does, allowing him to fly over to his family home, which has been completely ransacked by Cord soldiers as his family is dragged and surrounded outside. Fortunately, Jaime arrives just in time to prevent any of them from being harmed, and Kaji's incredible arsenal of weapons enables him to take on Cord's entire army himself as his family attempts to make a run for it. Although, as they're escaping, Alberto suddenly falls to the ground as he's suffering yet another heart attack, which distracts Jaime for a moment, allowing him to be taken down by a giant grappling hook fired from above by Ignacio Carapax, which also causes Khaji-Da to malfunction and shut down, allowing Carapax to easily drag Jaime away to their helicopter as a sudden explosion comes from within the home, resulting from a lit candle being knocked to the floor earlier, and as Alberto ultimately passes away. The family's left feeling completely defeated following Jaime's capture and Alberto's death. But Nana insists that now is not the time to cry, but to fight, and Jenny looks to help them do this, taking them back to her father's laboratory and into the bug ship, which they use to travel to Pago Island, a Caribbean island off the coast of Cuba that Cord bought from Batista in the 50s, and where Jenny believes they've taken Jaime. Meanwhile, Jaime awakens on Pago Island, trapped in a device that, Victoria explains, will allow them to transfer the Scarab's code directly into the OMAC, although the process will also likely kill Jaime. But she claims sacrifices must be made for the greater good, and begins the transfer, draining Jaime's life force and resulting in him entering what appears to be the afterlife, where he's reunited with his father, although this reunion isn't meant to last, as Alberto informs him that it's not his time yet, and that they've been brought together once again so he could help him become one with the Scarab. So they say their final goodbyes and share I love yous before Jaime, per Alberto's direction, calls and reaches out for Kaji, returning him to the present, fortunately just as his family and Jenny manage to break into the facility and shut down its systems, allowing him to free himself from the device and make a run for it. Unfortunately though, the transfer of the Scarab's code into the OMAC armor had already been completed, so Carapax now dons this new and even more powerful armor to unleash an attack on Jaime, who manages to escape him for now, before reuniting with his mother, Nana, and Rudy. With Milagro and Jenny still trapped somewhere in the building though, he's forced to head back inside once again to look for them. And luckily, after taking out a bunch of Cord soldiers, he quickly manages to find his sister. Jenny, on the other hand, had already been found and captured by Victoria, who prepares to kill Jenny herself, but her attempt is thwarted by a piece of Kabloom bubblegum, which is actually one of Jenny's father's creation that, upon being spat out, grows larger and larger and fills the chopper with foam, ultimately resulting in it crashing to the ground, not far from the ongoing battle between Jaime and Carapax. After finally getting his hands on Jaime, Carapax nearly managed to kill him, but was distracted just in the nick of time by Rudy, prompting him to then fire a blast in his direction, and yet another attack on his family unleashes an even more dangerous side of Jaime, allowing him to completely take control of the battle with the intent of killing Carapax. But his fatal blow is stopped by Kaji, who reveals that, during the transfer into Carapax's OMAC armor, they'd unlocked memories from his past that prove Carapax is just as much a victim of Victoria as he is. So Jaime, after being taken through everything Carapax had gone through, chooses to spare his life. This retrospective through his life also helps remind Carapax of everything Victoria had done to him, leading him to track Victoria down and grab hold of her while maxing out the energy reactor in his suit, before then dragging her with him into the fiery ruins of her crashed helicopter, which creates a huge explosion that kills them both and completely destroys the facility, along with any trace of the Scarab Code, while Jaime, Jenny, and the Reyes family manage to escape the destruction unscathed. In the aftermath of Victoria's death, Jennifer becomes the new CEO of Cord Industries and immediately looks to change the company for the better, announcing that they'll no longer be making weapons. Meanwhile, Jaime and his family take the time to mourn the loss of Alberto with support from their entire neighborhood, as well as Jenny, who also plans on getting Cord to fix and give them back their house. That's not the only positive development for Jaime though, as he and Jenny seem to be entering a romantic relationship, with them planning a first date and sharing a kiss, before things are then made even more interesting, as back in Jenny's father's laboratory, a recording from Ted Cord is suddenly broadcasted, in which he attempts to inform his daughter that he's still alive. And that was our recap of the DCEU timeline. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful in any way, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also, if you're curious as to what we thought of any of the DCEU's installments, be sure to check out our DCEU rankings with the first link in the description below. If you want to see our other DC content, you can also find that by clicking the second link in the description. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.